you ready?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So let's just jump right into it. So today is going to be talking a little bit more about, in this case, pro formas, but kind of from the developer's perspective instead of sort of what we've been doing is kind of from the owner's perspective. This kind of looks at things from the developer's perspective. So as a developer, the big difference between kind of the investor and the developer is typically the investor is buying a property that's already built in many cases. Not to say that investors can't invest in development deals, but in terms of kind of the type of analysis that we're typically looking at, the real estate investor is looking at something that's already built, already pretty much leased up, ready to go, and you're sort of looking at cash flows associated with that. Whereas from the developer's perspective, you're looking at, all right, you're buying raw land, you're building a building, you're leasing it up, you're getting it ready to potentially either sell or to manage on your own behalf, okay? And so this gets into the whole kind of philosophy of what kind of developer, you know, do you want to be, or what kind of developer, you know, do you want to work for, or, you know, what is kind of the difference in terms of the different types of developers? Because there are developers that will simply build a project, and as soon as they've got it built, and they have it leased up, or if it's a a condo project or whatever, have the unit sold, then potentially they're out of it. They're more of a merchant sort of developer, as opposed to the developer that wants to build something, and then once they build it, they're either going to occupy or they're going to get it leased up and then potentially own it, for however many years before they maybe sell it off, or they may never sell it off. So it's kind of each one's a little bit different. So what we're going to start with, and kind of one of the things that the way this particular text is organized, I think it's kind of an interesting way to approach it, is to look at it sort of from the negative cash flow, ultimately to you get to the positive cash flow. And so one of the things that they talk about is the sort of whole negative amortization and kind of the negative cash flow associated with being a developer, meaning you're going to be out of pocket, obviously, money up front whenever you buy the property and whenever you start construction, paying for the materials, paying for the construction that takes place, that sort of thing. And so how do you go about kind of dealing with that, and kind of what are those sort of costs and so forth? So let's just say we've got a project and we're going to do it over 12 months. All right, and we're going to go ahead and make the assumption that we're going to do what I would call an acquisition, development, and construction loan. All right. So this basically means we're going to get a loan up front that's going to be the sort of ADC, or Acquisition Development Construction Loan. We're going to borrow the money, in this particular instance, to acquire the land. We're going to borrow the money. Now, in some cases, you may actually, one of your developer partners or yourself, you could bring the land into the deal, okay? And that could be, in essence, your equity into the deal to convince the lender to potentially, do this deal with you. Or you could be in a situation, maybe because of your past history and that sort of thing, that the lender, whoever it is that you're working with, will allow you to actually finance the whole purchase of the land, finance all the construction costs, and then ultimately have the project built. So in this case, what we're really going to do, we're going to try to keep things relatively simple. But in terms of the acquisition price of the land, we're going to put that in as sort of our first cash outflow, okay? But it's not going to be our only cash outflow. It's just going to be our first cash outflow. So this is, once again, the acquisition of the land, okay? So give me a dollar amount just for the land.
3 million.
Okay? 1 million.
It's a small project. It's only
All right. So $1 million for the land. All right. And I want to keep it relatively simple. And so what we're going to do is, let's just say the first 5 months are going to be the construction. right? And then the next, basically 7 months, so 5 months construction, 7 months sales. Okay, so this could be, once again, a housing development, condo development, you know, that sort of thing. But and I know this is a short project, but I want to keep it simple. Okay, all right, we can stretch it out, but I want to fill it all on one page. Okay, so in this case, the construction piece, and now one of the things that, you know, obviously is the case in construction is, you know, typically, you know, your costs are not going to be the same from month to month in terms of the draws that you're going to do, because you're going to have sort of big ticket items that may come at one particular point in time in the construction process, and then smaller ticket items that maybe take a long time to actually do and to be associated with. And also, let me back up a little bit with regard to sort of this whole idea of kind of a construction loan. The best way to think of it, for those of you that have never gotten a construction loan, but most of you have had a credit card, okay? Construction loans are basically just like credit cards, okay? In essence, what you're doing is you're going to a bank and saying, okay, I want to do this project. This project's going to cost, you know, several $1 million, whatever that price tag is on the cost of the construction and the acquisition. And I want a line of credit for, let's just say it's $10 million, okay? And now what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, we're going to open up this line of credit just like you would, it would basically be like having a credit card with a $10 million limit on it. But you are not going to get all $10 million up front, okay? In other words, they're going to give you the money in what they call draws, okay? Meaning that you're going to go to them typically maybe once a month at the end of each month and sort of say, hey, I spent this money on, you know, whatever it was over this past month, and then they're going to, in essence, release that amount of funding to you for the project. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay. And so, in this case, what would have sort of happened is, all right, you know, here at time period 0, we've got whatever, you know, overall line of credit, and let's just say our project is going to be well, I said 10 million, so let's just go with 10 million. What the heck? All right, $10 million project. All right, so in this case, we would get, right as we buy the land, $1 million, in essence, draw to go pay for the land. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, is everybody comfortable with that? Yes or no?
Yeah. By development, you mean like soft cost?
Yeah, it could be whatever else that we've got to do. You know, I mean, and once again, all inclusive here would be getting the property maybe rezoned, getting you know, any sort of attorney fees, title fees, architect fees, whatever else we've got to do. Then, to keep things simple, we've got 5 months of construction. That means that we've got basically $9 million left over that we can spend, right, on this project. But there's nothing that inherently says that we've got to spend that entire amount, okay? So it could very well be that we spend maybe $1.5 million each month Now, I'm keeping the numbers the same only for simplicity's sake. And if you're worried I'm not going to do that on the quiz, yes, I'm going to do it on the quiz. So don't, get overly worked up about that component of it. Because we could make it a lot more complex if we all of a sudden, make these numbers different, and I can explain that as well. Okay. So in this case, just to kind of keep things in perspective, and all of these are going to be cash outflows. Okay? And all of those just simply represent phases of the construction process that we are, in essence, doing. Okay? And so in this case, let's just kind of do the math here. 1.5 million times 5 months would be $7,500,000 plus the $1 million obviously purchase. So really, at the conclusion of all of this, we have spent basically $8,500,000. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Just in terms of the raw sort of cost associated with it. Okay, now what is subsequently going to happen is we anticipate that we're going to start selling here in month 6 all of the units. Now, once again, I'm trying to keep it simple so that we keep it from being overly messy in terms of the calculation piece of this. But we're just going to kind of make the assumption, all right, starting in month 6, we're going to start generating income from sales, okay? And so let's just say we keep that relatively constant. And we say that for the next 7 months, we're going to do $2 million a month in sales. All right, so now if you total that up, 2 million times 7 months would be what?
14.
So right off the bat, we can tell we're going to have a home run project, okay? In the sense that our construction cost and acquisition cost are 8.5 million, our sales are 1.4, or I'm sorry, 1 million, I can't talk, 14 million, okay? So just based on that, with no sort of time value of money impacts, we've got 5.5 million sort of gross profit, if you will. Okay? But we have to take into account the fact that this 8.5 million is not free, okay? We have to pay some form of interest on that, obviously, during that construction period, that the lender is not just gonna give us that money for free. So the question is, how much, in essence, are they going to charge us for that money, okay? So let's just say we've got a 10% sort of cost of borrowing here. All right. So, assuming that in this particular case that we chose to not pay them back until maybe we could start paying them back here at month 6, but for kind of the simplicity of our example, let's make the assumption that we really don't pay them back until we have sold off everything. Okay? Not going to happen quite that way, but we're trying to keep it relatively simple. All right? So what we're going to do, in essence, is you're going to have to say, for each of these dollar amounts, how much basically interest would be accrued over the entire life of this project. Okay? Does that make sense? All right? So how are we going to do that? In other words, from a time value of money perspective, how are we going to do that? Because these are our cash flows.
The future value of the 8,500.
Okay, so in essence, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be trying to say, yeah, what is in essence going to be the future value of these all compounded forward, if we will, to the end of here, and that would be the most interest that we would have. Okay. Assuming that we didn't obviously start trying to pay it back as we're receiving these cash flows. Does that make sense? Okay. So in this case, let's kind of do that. All right. So what we could do is, once again, this is going to be 12 payments per year, because this is monthly. All right, monthly compounding, monthly payments, that sort of thing. So what we could start out with is we could say, all right, we've got $1 million. Oops, too many zeros. We've got $1 million, and that is going to be a cash outflow to us. And so we can approach this a couple different ways. One is that we put that $1 million in as our present value, and we say, okay, how much borrowing that $1 million is going to cost us from borrowing it today with the 10% interest rate over how many months?
12.
12 is what we're saying we're going to pay off everything at the end. So 12 in. And then we would simply solve for future value. Okay, so let's see what we get. Yep.
1104,622.
Yep. 1104. Well, actually, 713. Yep. 07. Okay. So that's how much, in this particular case, the $1 million is going to, in essence, cost us at the end of month 12. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Couldn't, hey, just go back 1 second.
Trying to kind of separate out and make it a little bit easier to digest. Now that's if we wanted to carry it all the way out to month 12 after all these sales have occurred. But we could, if we wanted to simply say, all right, how much would we actually owe here at the end of month 5? And then start having to just pay it back sort of as we can off of those RMS. Just depending on how I choose to sort of ask it, you've got a couple of different options here. But so this would be just for the original acquisition price. Now, for the construction piece, sort of clear everything.
Isn't that a net present value?
Yeah, well, in essence, but not quite. Okay, so in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say 1.5 million. Those are all going to be negatives, but we're going to make them a payment amount, okay, because they're going to recur for a total of 5 months with our 10% interest rate. And here, what we're going to do, we're going to solve for future value. This is kind of a two-stepper. All right, so we put those in. For 5 months, 10% interest rate, solve for the future value. Now what this is going to do this is going to give us what the accumulated interest is of that of all those 1.5 million right here at the end of this time period. Does that make sense? Whereas the other one we carried forward all the way to 12 months. Now the reason we did that was to obviously carry forward all the way to the very end. Here we're going to do the same thing, but we have to sort of do this first piece because from the calculator's perspective, we are saying, all right, we're spending $1.5 million a month for 5 months, and we want to know kind of what the balance is here, because then from here, we're going to take that balance, and then we're going to compound it forward another 7 months. Okay, sort of, like I said, sort of a two-step process. So what you're going to do, sort of clear everything out. And we're going to put in the 7626 to 04601 as our present value, because we're starting now at basically month 7, or I'm sorry, month 5, and we're going to be compounding it forward for 7 more months at the 10% interest rate. Okay, so let's see what we get. Should get $8,082,175.77. So now what we can do is we can take our $1,104,713.07, add it to the $8,082,175.77.
We're keeping the 7 mil positive?
Well, you can put it in as negative. I'm sorry, that's just me skipping little steps. Okay? All right, so we add that. And we end up with 9,186,888.84. Okay? So this number represents what? That represents all of our expenditures, the 8.5 million, compounding all of it forward to the end of the year. And so by doing that, what we're able to sort of say is we had 8.5 million of expenditures. We have a total we owe of 9,186,000. So that means, in terms of just interest cost, we want to kind of back that out. $686,888.84 of interest cost during that period. Okay, does that make sense?
So the 11 is the interest accumulated for the land. The 808 is the
Yes.
interest accumulated on the ongoing payments.
Yep.
And then together is the 91 less the
Yep.
85.
Yep.
Less the,
Okay, and then the
Yep. This is simply less our total,
cost to borrow.
just total cost. Okay. Whereas the 9,186,000 is actually our total cost of borrowing. Okay. All right. So there, if we simply want to then take and say, all right, the 14 million that we are generating, and we want to subtract out the 91,86,888.84, we end up 4,813,111 of profit
Real profit.
after basically cost of debt.
I have a question.
Yep.
We're not considering any interest in the project?
We're getting there.
Okay.
Okay, so in terms of sort of making the comparison between what we had done previously, which was saying, all right, in terms of gross profit, we've got 5.5 million based upon sale price of all the units, subtracting out the actual cost of development. We had 5.5 million in gross profit. Now,
Then we have to replace it.
what we're saying is based on just the borrowing cost piece, it's really 4.8 million, okay? Now, here's the thing. What we could be doing is, as I said earlier, we could, you know, as we start to receive this money, we could start to pay down basically that line of credit, much the same way you would pay down a credit card, okay? It makes things a little bit more complex, but nonetheless, that's what we could do, okay? So this is making the assumption, this particular example is simply making the assumption that we're gonna just simply bank all of this income, and then at the end of the 12 months, when we've got the full 14 million sitting in the bank, we're gonna make one lump sum payment to the lender for that 9 million, whatever it was, 9,186,888. Okay, does that make sense? Now, to your point, what we could do is also say, okay, as we receive this money, we immediately pop it into the bank and we try to earn interest on it. You know, using short-term securities, probably not going to get that much of an interest rate on it, but nonetheless, that could be, you know, we could end up accumulating a nice little balance there. And we're going to get into another problem a little bit later when we talk about sort of the financing rate versus basically the income rate. Okay? But I want to kind of go back and I want to do this a different way to kind of illustrate just another way to approach it. Okay.
Sorry, you added the interest cost to that and you got the 5.5, is that right?
Okay. The interest cost.
Right, so you got the 4.813, and then you said the gross profit was 5.5.
Yeah, but this is simply the reason why this is really the profit. This is the profit after we have subtracted out all of our interest costs.
Okay.
So really, this should just simply be this much less than the 5.5 million. In other words, if you take 5.5 million and you subtract out 686, you should get the 4.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Now, let's simplify this a little bit. Okay. Yep.
You may be leading on to this, so it's fine.
I probably am.
What can you do a cash flow analysis?
We are.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's simplify things a little bit more and just simply look at this instead of these sort of sale costs. Let's just focus exclusively on sort of the acquisition and the construction cost and just simply getting a balance at a particular period of time. All right. So once again, so let's say, give me a price for the land.
1.5.
1.5 million. All right, we went up a little bit. All right. So 1.5 million for the land. All right, and this time, let's do the construction cost, you know, on a monthly basis, same dollar amount each month. So let's just say, I don't know, $150,000 a month in construction. All right, so that's going to be the same all the way to the very end. Okay, so this will be a simpler problem to kind of wrap your head around. All right, so in this case, once again, 12 monthly payments. Well, once again, these are all going to be, I'm sorry, cash outflows, because this is all construction. Okay, so 12 payments per year. Clear everything out. Then you're going to put into 1,500,000 as a negative, and we're going to put this in as a present value. Then we're going to put the 150,000 as a negative, and we're going to put that in as a payment. And then here we're going to say that that 150,000 that occurs for 12 months. And what's going to be your cost of interest? 10. So 10% interest cost. Now, to find out what we owe at the end of all this, all we're going to do is we're going to solve for future value. Okay? So in this case, and what do we get?
3,541,408.
Okay. So this is another just variation of this, but this only takes into account just the construction cost aspect. And so we're simply saying, once again, we acquired the property for this. We have outflows of construction costs, the draws of $150,000 a month for each of the next 12 months. And then at the end of the 12 months, with this 10% interest rate, how much do we actually owe the bank? Okay, now, let's also just kind of to put things into perspective, how much are we talking about here? So 150,000 times 12 is 1.8 million, plus our initial outflow of 1.5 million. So total sort of outflow would be what? 3.3 million. Okay, so that is the raw sort of money that we have borrowed is 3.3 million, but we actually owe 3.541 million simply because of that accumulated interest cost over that 12-month period. Yes?
So sorry, Professor, could you just go back to the last piece? I completely got lost.
Okay. Where do you want me to start? Just right
from there.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So once again, this example is just simply saying, okay, we've bought the property up front here at time period 0 for 1.5 million. Then each and every month we spent $150,000 on basically renovations or construction costs for that property. At the end of all of this, after 12 months, how much do we actually spend? Well, we spent the 1.5 million up front. 150,000 times 12 is 1.8 million. So you add those two together, that's 3.3 million total out-of-pocket expenditures. But then over here, this is simply doing it from the kind of the lender's perspective of how much we're going to owe them. We initially borrowed the 1.5, then the 150 we borrowed as a continual payment, recurring payment every month for the next 12 months at a 10% interest rate. So at the end of the 12 months, this is how much we owe the lender. But this is the amount that we actually borrowed. So in essence, our interest cost is going to be the difference. So 3,541,904.82 minus 3,300,000. Or 241,904.82 in interest cost. Okay? Make sense? All right. So, any questions about that? Okay, now one of the things to sort of take note of here, and this is kind of the way your book sort of, looks at this, is this is, to a certain extent, while this is a construction loan, it's also sort of an example of negative amortization occurring. And what that means is simply you owe more, to a certain extent, as sort of time goes on, you owe more than you originally borrowed because interest is accruing over time, just like it would with a credit card, okay? You keep charging stuff, and if you're not paying down the balance, you're gonna owe more and more with interest on top of interest and so forth, so on, okay? Make sense? Now, here's another thing. We talked a little bit about this kind of, this sort of previous thing, but, one of the points is, well, why don't you just, sort of pay this back as you can, going through this? And in some instances, I mean, yeah, you would love to do that, but if you don't have, like in this particular example, you don't have any income sources, how are you going to pay it back? It's not until you either sell the property or you lease the property or whatever that you're going to have a positive cash flow sort of coming in. Everybody comfortable with that? Yep.
On the one that we did before,
Yep.
you talked about, okay, we'll do like a lump sum payment.
Right.
Is that common?
No, not really. I did that just for simplicity's sake, but the reality of it would be more of, probably saying that, yeah, as this cash flow is coming in, you're going to be subtracting out other sort of ancillary expenses, that sort of thing, but then trying to then pay the lender
Well,
back.
'cause it makes sense to me that, I'm sorry, put this money in the bank, make interest.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? So-
you have some flexibility with the lender as to when the payments have to start occurring and that sort of thing. And in many instances, you don't want to necessarily delay the payment, completely, because usually that borrowing cost for an acquisition, development, construction loan is at a much higher interest rate than a normal traditional mortgage. And so the chances of you being able to really bank this money and get an above average rate of return on that to be able to use to somehow offset, probably not going to happen. But there's also another piece. There's a lot of different little lessons in this and trying to make sure that I convey, and that's kind of the reason to sort of set this up, just to kind of explain things. Another aspect of this is that you may have an arrangement with the lender where you have release provisions, that as you sell the units, then they will in essence release them from the overall loan. Like for example, if it's a condo project and you sell maybe the top 5 floors, then they potentially would release those out of the inventory because you paid them off, so to speak. And so sort of pay as you go to a certain extent in terms of what portion of the loan you're actually paying off. Does that make sense? Okay. The problem, however, with some of those release provisions is what if you're selling the premium units first, and then as you get toward the tail end, you have the crappy units left over that no one wants, that no one's willing to buy, and now all of a sudden maybe you can't pay the lender back.
Right.
Okay.
That goes the same for the next unit where you have like the premium units at the top.
Yep.
The okay units in the middle and then commercial
Right.
on the bottom. It would play out the same way.
It could. I mean, just depending on the property. In some cases, all the units may be somewhat premium. I mean, some more so than others, but at the same time, each property is going to be different and unique. But there's no question that historically, the ones with the best views, the ones on the higher levels, the ones with the right facing north, all those kinds of things tend to factor into what that premium is going to be, or the discount is going to be if it's a unit that has much less attractive kind of features. Okay, moving forward. All right, so that gets us through basically the first question. All right.
Is there penalties for paying off, right? So you can't really.
Well, usually with construction loans, there's not usually going to be a prepayment penalty, whereas with a traditional, normal, permanent mortgage, the lender may say, yeah, your term is for 5 years. We don't want you to pay off early, we want you to go the full term of the 5 years, and we may even preclude you from paying it off early. But usually with construction loans, it's just the opposite in the sense that the lender, because it's sort of set up like a credit card, you know, their whole idea is they kind of want to make sure they get their money back, you know, and so it's a little bit of a different kind of risk profile.
And they don't want to own property either,
Well, yeah, exactly. Or a half-finished project.
right? Right.
And it's not comparable to like a typical line of credit?
No, it is. I mean,
Because I know with some lines of credit, so say, you know, I have a line of credit for
Right.
10 million, I take out 5.
Right.
I can kind of set a specific interest rate on that 5 that I've taken, and then if I need to take more, then I take more, and then that's going to be the regular rate.
And that is very possible as well.
Okay.
But generally, with a construction loan, it's going to be sort of a fixed interest rate for usually some sort of a somewhat predetermined kind of construction period, or at least a ballpark. I mean, realizing there are always going to be construction delays, or you're going to be ahead of schedule, or, you know, this, you know, but for the most part, it's a revolving line of credit that just simply says, okay, you know, whatever you've drawn down is what you owe us, plus the interest is accumulated on that, and the longer that you don't sell or you don't get it refinanced into a permanent loan, the more interest that you're going to pay us. Because here's what could happen also, is that normally you have what's called a takeout commitment, which is once you have a construction loan, at some point in the process of finishing up the project, and it could happen earlier rather than later, you know, once again, all of this is sort of fluid. Normally your construction lender will say, we want a specific lender to guarantee a takeout commitment, to take us out of having this financing and to put them as the permanent finance holder or the lien holder. Because the construction lender may not necessarily be the same lender as the permanent lender. And in many cases they're not, because the construction lender typically will be a local lender that has people boots on the ground, so to speak, to go out, kind of inspect the project, make sure things are being done in a timely, efficient manner, and that you're not really making up your expenses and that sort of thing. And then, but my point is that at some point that construction lender is saying, hey, we want to be taken out of this deal and we want some sort of permanent lender on the hook. Well, normally what is required for the permanent lender to take out the construction lender is some sort of a specified set of criteria. Usually it will be you are, you know, 85, 95, 100% done with the construction, and you are 60, 70, 80% pre-leased or pre-sold, or whatever the issue is, usually pre-leased, because if it's permanent loan, it's usually a property you're holding for investment. But the point being is that there usually be some sort of criteria, and then that once you meet all of those sort of requirements, then the permanent lender steps in and says, okay, it's our loan now, we're going to pay off the construction lender, and we're, you know, now starting with our monthly payment scheme of whatever that's going to be. Make sense? Okay. All righty. Where was I? What did I do with my handout? Okay. So one of the things that this is actually, and it's kind of funny whenever you've been teaching something for so long, and you actually see a book that incorporates something that you've been teaching, but you've never ever seen it anywhere else in a book. So it's kind of cool. In this case, the tenant sort of focused sort of risk assessments. And by this, what we sort of mean is, let's say that you've got a property that you're potentially going to be investing in, or you're going to be building, whatever the case may be. You, as the developer, as the investor, whatever, have probably some sort of idea of who your tenants are going to be. Okay, and in this case, we're typically talking about commercial tenants. And the question is, should we value the leases differently for different type of tenants? And what I mean by that is you can have a really strong national high credit tenant that obviously has very little risk associated with getting their monthly check from them for the rent. Does that make sense? Versus you rent to some sort of local, startup, or not really fully established sort of tenant that has a lot of risk that you don't know whether you're going to get paid or you're not going to get paid, whether you're going to get paid on time, you're going to get paid late, all those kinds of issues. So to what extent should you treat that differently? And should maybe an investor treat that differently? Should a lender treat that differently? And I have always argued, and this, like I said, this is the first time I've actually seen a textbook author actually put it into print, is that you should isolate out those individual tenants as per their credit quality and accordingly value the leases differently based upon their in essence, their credit scores or their credit rating. Does that make sense? Kenny?
Is that also taking into account the length of the lease that they're signing?
It can.
Would that make a difference though?
Well, yeah, in one sense, because if it's a one-year lease, you can sort of say, okay, hopefully they can scrape enough money together to keep the lease going for a year. But if it's a 5-year lease, then, well, what's the viability or likelihood that they're going to be in business for the next 5 years?
So it increases the
Well, the risk increases over time, in one sense, because the longer the lease, you're really betting on that company still being in business, 5 years into the future, kind of thing, or longer.
Yeah, it's an unproven project.
Right. Okay, make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, so here's what we're in essence saying. We've got tenant A and tenant B. Okay, tenant A high quality, low risk. Okay, over here, lower quality, higher risk. Maybe more rent, maybe not. That's also another feature of this. It's not necessarily that it's not necessarily that you're going to charge them more rent. It may just simply be how do you go about adjusting the rent that you're receiving or potentially going to receive. In other words, you're putting a higher discount rate on tenant B than you would on tenant A. So, for example,
isn't that the same thing as higher rent?
Indirectly, but in terms of the actual rent you're charging them, it's the same. What you're hoping is, in one sense, if you did charge actually higher rent to B, that you're going to make out like a bandit if they pay all their rent.
Or like maybe charge like double or triple security, things like that, right?
You can adjust it a variety of different ways, okay? So in our case, what we're going to sort of say is that because they're a low-risk tenant, we're going to apply maybe a 5% discount rate on their rent. And the higher quality tenant, maybe we're going to apply a 10% discount rate. All right? So let's assume, all right, give me a dollar amount of their rent per square foot per year. How much?
15.
Okay, $20 per square foot per year. We're going to charge them both the same to illustrate the issue. And how many square feet are they going to lease?
5,000.
5,000 square feet. You guys love these small spaces. Okay, 5,000 square feet. Okay, and what's the lease term in terms of years? 10. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to calculate the present value of the leases for tenant A and tenant B. Okay, Now, instead of me walking you through it right this second, I want to see if you can kind of get most of it done yourself. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to just try to see if you can think through what you would do. If you don't have a clue, that's okay. We'll do what you can.
Would we need to put in like a 12, like a, 10-year, never mind, I'm sorry.
Can you explain in theory what you mean by you're applying a discount rate to the money that you're getting?
You're basically saying that you have a greater likelihood of receiving this rent from this tenant, tenant A, because they are higher quality, lower risk. Therefore, you are going to discount their rent at a lower rate, okay, implying the low risk, okay?
Like implying that you're giving them a discount just
Well, you're not giving them a discount. What you're doing is you're in essence simply saying there is a greater likelihood that we are going to receive all of our rent from these folks, and from these folks, there's a greater likelihood we're not going to receive some of that rent. So we're sort of pre-determining what amount that we think we might receive by discounting it more.
okay.
So in other words, what's going to happen is the present value of the lease for A is going to be higher than the present value for the lease for B, meaning you as the property owner would prefer to go with tenant A over tenant B under this set of circumstances, okay? But I want you to see if you can work through the calculations to get there. It's just a simple present value problem. Don't make it complicated. If you think you have the answer, let me know.
I got an answer.
Okay, so what's the present value do you have for the lease A?
613, 913, 25 cents.
The same thing I got.
Okay, what about for B?
385, 543, 29 cents.
Okay, well, let's see. Anybody else have similar numbers
977.
for this one, for A? Okay, you got 977. And what, 977 what?
Hold on, I erased it.
Okay, well, we'll come back. Okay, all right, so here's what we're going to do. All right, so for A, okay, first thing we're going to do one payment per year, since this is annual. You're going to put in, you're going to clear everything out. Then you're going to put in 5% as your interest rate. Then we've got to multiply 20 times 5,000,
That's your payment, right?
okay, which is going to be,
100,000.
Your parents.
okay, so 100,000
It's your annual payment.
is going to be your payment. Then the lease is going to be for
10 years.
10 years. Then you're going to solve for present value. So
I
it's,
got 772,173.
okay, hold on.
Oh,
Thank you, girl.
Yeah, no, but I did like
How
this
calculated,
whole-
calculated.
Yeah.
and then add all this, and then
so is that just like why 10% though? You just assuming that you're gonna get 90% of the rent?
That's your discount, right?
Okay, in this case, well, this is only for tenant A. For tenant B,
Well, I mean, for
okay, so for tenant B, all that you're going to change is the interest rate.
but honestly, it's just like the conceptual side, like yeah.
Once I can finish, okay, so for B, the only thing you have to change is to change the interest rate, so you don't have to redo everything. You can just type in 10% is your new interest rate, and then solve for present value. And so you end up with 614, 456, 71. Okay, so we did not get the correct answers there.
That's it,
Because
you
I
did a
didn't
million.
include the 100,000, I did it as like a future value.
I did it as a million too, by accident,
so
that's
did
why
I.
I got sent.
Yeah.
Okay,
You did
all
too.
right, so
Value of a million and then back.
now to answer Cole's question, Cole is like, okay, well, why are we doing the 10% versus 5% and so forth? What we're simply saying is we think there is a much greater likelihood that we're going to get paid in full by tenant A, and that there's a chance that we're maybe going to get late payments or we're going to get no payment or whatever it might be for tenant B. Therefore, that's why we have this higher discount rate assigned to B. So in terms of sort of translating that into reality, what we're saying is that if I'm a lender or I'm an investor, I would much prefer that you have high quality, high credit rated tenants than lower quality, lower credit rated tenants, because at the end of the day, there's a very good chance that you may not get paid or get paid really in full of what you're owed. And so, once again, this is an academic example, but it's meant to try to represent reality in the sense of, we know people have credit scores and businesses have credit scores for a reason. Okay? The reason those exist is they take a look at what has been their past behavior, what has been their stability of income, what has been, their employment history or the years in business or whatever it might be. How much debt do they already have? All those kinds of things that get swirled into some sort of a credit rating. And, now does that automatically mean that you're not going to get your money from tenant B? No. It just simply means we're putting them at a higher risk profile, that there's a greater chance we're not going to receive some of that rent. And so what that translates into, in terms of raw dollars, sort of from an upfront perspective, is, well, it's over almost $150,000 difference between these two. Okay, so let me do the closer math. But 772, I'm just going to round it off. 772 minus 614, so 158,000 difference. All right. So all that's saying is that in the mind of an investor, in the mind of a lender, we would much rather have higher quality tenants than lower quality tenants. Okay. That does not mean, as I said, in absolute certainty that we're not going to be able to collect fully the payments that we're receiving from this other group of tenants. It means that we're simply applying a higher risk profile to those individuals or businesses.
Piggybacking on your last comment that you're not going to get it, but would one of the ways that you would mitigate this risk factor of a low quality tenant is to include heavy covenants as to, if you go bankrupt,
Sure,
you're still obligated as to the complete lease?
there could be all sorts of things that you put into place to try to limit your risk.
But would
Or
that
shorter
lower the
lease,
risk factor that you would associate with that client?
I'm sorry?
Would that lower the risk profile that you place on that
It could,
tenant
yeah,
by increasing those covenants?
sure. There are other things you could do to mitigate the risk. I mean, you could require them to pay their rent once a week instead of once a month. You could, and then that way, that if they can't pay it 1 week, you immediately start the eviction process. So it's like there's a lot of things that you could do to sort of try to mitigate this process to make sure that you're going to get paid, or the lender's going to get paid, or the investor's going to get paid, whoever's perspective it is that you're looking at it. My point, and this is also what Argus does as well, those of you that are kind of getting into this, is that you're going to start saying, okay, what quality tenant do I have? What kind of lease do I have? What is the prospect of renewal? What is the credit rating of this tenant, and how is that going to impact the overall valuation of this project? Because in essence, what we're sort of saying This is another way to sort of look at this. And I think this is where maybe some of the confusion is kind of maybe coming from, is if this is a single tenant property, you either have tenant A or you have tenant B. In essence, what you're saying is if you lease it out to a higher quality tenant, even though they're paying the same dollar amount in rent, that means that if you were to lease it out to a lower quality tenant, the property has lower value.
So like a sophisticated investor who's accounting for that in his head, it's like really just like a buffer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In other words, you could also sort of say, maybe it's the same exact project, and not necessarily two different tenants, but maybe one in an economically challenged area versus one in an economically buoyant area. Does that make sense? And you would make kind of that same sort of adjustment that, like, I don't want to get too specific, but let's say you want to plop down, I don't know, a Dunkin' Donuts, and you want to put one of them in a really, high trafficked, high income area, and you want to put one in a, lower income area. Is there a chance that as a result of doing so that you've maybe set the one that you put in the lower income area up, maybe not necessarily for failure, but because it's higher risk of potentially, being robbed, or higher risk of something else happening in that area, then, should you make an adjustment, is all I'm saying.
Does that shrink the number because
Yes.
it's all up front? Like if you did it on a monthly basis, it would
Right.
It would be closer.
Yeah,
to
all you're doing is, once again, you're trying to predict the impact of that risk over time, and trying to quantify. And sometimes it's not going to be a perfect quantification.
Yeah.
It's more of just trying to think about it in the context of how can I do everything I possibly can to minimize my risk and maximize the value of my project. Let's think about it in a more broader sense for a moment. Let's say that, once again, we build an apartment complex, because you can do this on the individual level. And let's just say that in this particular apartment complex, we are not going to admit anyone to this apartment complex that has a credit score below 800.
Oh.
Okay?
So is there a discount rate or?
No, but just hear me out. But we're not going to let anybody into this apartment complex that has a credit score below 800. All right? And then this other apartment complex, maybe, their standard is, 600. Okay? Well, what does that mean? Does that mean, theoretically, the apartment complex that maybe has hundreds of units in it with people with credit scores of above 800, chances are they're all going to be paying their rent, paying it on time, like clockwork, versus the one where the credit scores are, let's say, 600. There's a less likelihood that they're going to be paying on time. That's all this is really saying, is you're trying to make a quantifiable adjustment for that.
Is there like a set discount rate?
Yes.
Support indicator.
Yes.
Is there like a set discount rate for a credit score though? Or like is that just
You would basically try over time to
develop it?
to develop it. I mean, to basically say, all right, if the credit score is above this, then this could be the risk profile. And lenders do it all the time. When you go to get a car loan, do you think that your interest rate is the same as everybody else's? It's not. Okay? It's based on your credit score. Okay? They're saying, okay, yeah, you got an 800 plus in your credit score. We're going to give you a near 0% interest rate, whereas your credit score is just off the charts bad. They may say, okay, 15% interest rate for you.
More likely they're not going to loan it to you.
Or maybe not loan it to you. Okay. Okay, moving forward. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. We're going to come back to this one. All right. Let's talk about going in versus going out cap rates. All right. So one of the things that you will hear people quite often talk about, especially from an investor's perspective, developer's perspective, they talk about a going-in cap rate, and they talk about a terminal cap rate or a going-out cap rate. And what they're meaning by that is you buy a property maybe at one cap rate, but then a few years later you sell it and it sells at a different cap rate. Now, if you've read the book, then you kind of hopefully understand this. If you haven't, let's just see if you can kind of think through it. What would you prefer? Would you prefer to have, let's just sort of say, going in versus going out cap rates? Once again, we'll say cap rates. Would you prefer that the going in cap rate is greater than the going out cap rate? Would you prefer that it is less than? Would you prefer that it's equal to?
Greater than.
Greater than.
Wouldn't that depend on the?
Well, it depends on a lot of things, but if you have the choice up front, whenever you buy or invest in a property, which one of those that you could choose, which one would you choose?
Greater than.
You would prefer greater than. Okay, and here's why. All right.
I read it.
So, we go back to our good friend Irv. We put kind of, in this case, both of these, this is going in, this is going out. All right, and in this case, let's say that the income on the property is $100,000 in net operating income, and our cap rate is, let's say, 10%. Okay, what would that mean our value is? 1 million. Okay, on this side, let's assume that the income stays constant at 100,000. But we can sell it at a cap rate of 5%. And we'll explain how that can happen, but what would that mean the value is?
2 million.
2 million. Twice the value. Okay? So the going in cap rate higher than the going out cap rate. Now, how can that occur? Okay, you want to give me any explanation?
Value add?
No, the income
That's
didn't,
a value add.
the income didn't go up, so not.
I'm sorry?
The income didn't go up, so like market.
The market.
Okay, the market, but what dictates the market?
You
Like,
could have gotten a really good.
more-
Maybe other properties
Selling.
that are selling in the market, but at the end of the day, what is it really indicative of?
Rents.
Yes, but it's indicative of the risk profile of the property, is it not? That in essence, you buy it up here for a 10% cap, but then because now you've got it fully leased, now you've got it fully occupied, now that you've done everything you need to do and it's stabilized, it appears to be less risky to an outside investor. Therefore, they're willing to pay more for it and get a much lower rate of return. Okay? Or, now here's the part that once again tries to tie together what we just talked about. Here, we had crappy tenants. Here, we've got Class A tenants. Same expected cash flow, difference in value. Does that make sense?
Even if income doesn't change?
Even if the income goes, because it's more certain over here, more predictable over here. You've got people with 800 credit scores over here, whereas people with 600 credit scores over here.
In residential, it wouldn't work like that though, right? It would mainly be like single tenant stuff.
It could. Keep in mind, while some of this, some of it's academic to talk about, but at the same time, it still filters into the mindset of the investor, okay? This is stuff that they're thinking about. I mean, while, I'm using these extreme examples of 800 credit scores versus 600 credit scores, that sort of thing, but the reality is, just think of yourself just using common sense. Would you rather own a property with potentially a bunch of low credit score tenants, yes, or would you prefer to own a property with a bunch of high credit score tenants if you owned it? Okay, not saying about buying it or whatever. I'm saying if you owned it, what would you prefer? You would automatically prefer to have the high credit tenants in the sense of you're going to get your money, you're going to get it on time, you're not going to have issues and problems with late payments and defaults and that sort of thing. Whereas over here, you're taking a chance that somebody is going to pay their rent late, that they have, for whatever reason, they get excuse after excuse of not being able to come up with their rent and on time and whatever it might be. And so from that standpoint, you would prefer, to have this tenant. Well, that inherently gives your property more inherent value to the overall market as a whole. Now, having just said that, there's a good chance that this lower quality tenant may actually be fine, may actually pay their rent on time. They may have just, may have had some hiccups with their credit, they lost their job, this, that, the other thing, and you're still going to get your money, but yet, just from the mindset of the investor alone, you would prefer to have the ones with the higher credit scores. That's what I'm saying. Does that make sense? Yep.
From a leasing, I used to do leasing in New York, apartments, and on average, people with bad credits, and depending on where, you have to look at the credit and see where they started from and where they are now. Folks with very high credit stayed on average of, let's say, a year in an apartment, and then they moved by a house. People with bad credit stayed 4 years. So from a landlord's point of view, you actually had a better tenant with a low credit score.
And I think that's a valid point, because they have less mobility. Because with a lower credit quality tenant, they're not going to be able to afford a house. They're not going to be able to want to necessarily go through the brain damage of having to get approved again. So yeah, they're going to stay put. So there's a very good likelihood of that. I don't disagree.
From a landlord's point of view, I like when the tenant moved out every 6 months, because I can go in, renovate.
Yeah, leasing commissions. Yeah, absolutely.
And no, I don't pay leasing commissions as a landlord. The tenant pays that, because this is New York and Tana.
Okay.
Right? When the tenant moves out, I paint it, and I'm adding 18% to the rent, as per my local regulatory agency.
Yep.
So the new tenant comes in, is going to pay 18% more than the old tenant. All I'm doing is painting the place, maybe changing the floors.
Well, you got rent controls.
So it's better for me to have the crappy tenant.
I can understand that.
Than the guy with the 800. I don't want the 800 credit score guy.
No, I can see that. But at the end of the day, in terms of sheer risk of receiving rents, that's all I'm trying to articulate, okay? Okay? It's merely a situation of we, as investors or developers, we have to have some sort of way of thinking about this that hopefully helps us to make better decisions about what it is that we do. Do we necessarily have to go through and quantify every little thing? No. But sometimes through that quantification, we can kind of begin to identify, okay, why are we doing it this way? We're doing it this way because we're trying to make some sort of a calculated adjustment as to how it impacts things. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, moving forward.
More applicable to like commercial stuff, right?
It can be applicable to anything. It's just a question of at the end of the day, what influences value? It's the income and it's the risk associated with that income.
Would the same be true if I'm like, let's say, a home builder that's building for a middle-class family in the 250 to 300 range? would the same rate of return or the same risk profile be assessed?
Potentially. I mean, you can apply it, in a variety of different ways. All I'm saying is this is something you should think about. In terms of the stability of that income as expressed by the cap rate. Because ultimately, stability lowers the cap rate and increases the value.
Well, in my scenario, it would be the sale rate, because how fast can I sell?
Well, yeah, also, in terms of how much inventory do you have to, if you are building the inventory speculatively, how much of it do you have to keep in stock, and how quickly is it turning over? Versus if you're doing completely custom homes, then the only carrying cost or your land cost. Okay, all right, moving forward. Now, nicely, this takes care of 2 questions on the quiz. Okay? Now, the third question is, as your text, I think, specifically calls it, the gross development profit margin. Okay, here what you're going to be doing is taking the going in cap rate divided by the going out cap rate minus 1. Okay, so let's just see what we get. All right, and I'll explain it. So the going in cap rate, 10%. The going out cap rate, 5%. Okay, minus 1. So let's see what we get. So 0.10 divided by 0.05 is 2. 2 minus 1 is 1, or a 100% increase. Okay, and all that's really, that's exactly what you see. You jump from $1 million in value to $2 million in value, which is a 100% increase. Does that make sense? Now, what this is sort of also kind of referring to in the development context is there's risk associated with being a developer. Risk that you don't necessarily have, or the same type of risk that you have as an investor. Okay? As a developer, think about all the things that you have to do before you actually open the doors for occupancy. Okay? As a developer versus buying the property once it's fully occupied, the doors are open, ready to go. Very big difference. Because obviously on the development side, you got to buy the land, you potentially have to go through zoning changes, you have to deal with all the different governmental regulations to kind of building codes and changes and requirements that maybe occur there that impact your construction cost. You've got to deal with obviously your construction folks, and you've got to deal with weather constraints and issues. You've got to, just like a mind-blowing number of things that you potentially have to deal with before you kind of get to that point of, sort of building is built, ready for occupancy. So from that standpoint, one way to kind of look at that is if you were actually buying, or if you were actually building a building on your own, you would probably have to employ a higher cap rate. Okay, because of all the risk associated with getting from raw dirt to open building. Yes? Just in conceptually, it's higher risk, is what I'm saying. Versus turnkey by the building. So here's a good way to express this. Kind of using similar sort of methodology here. All right, so let's just say we could build a building. Okay, give me the total cost of building that building. Building the building, you know, once again, acquiring the land, everything, all inclusive.
3 million.
3 million, okay. All right, and in this case, the cap rate that we're going to apply maybe is, let's say, 7%. Okay. All right, so then, based on that, what would be the income that it would generate? Let's just kind of do the math here for a second.
210.
Once again, for those of you trying to remember how to get that number, all you're doing is just taking the value times the cap rate, that gives us the income, okay? All right, so over here, because maybe we're buying a property, not building it, we're in essence going to give ourselves maybe a lower sort of cap rate because we don't have to generate maybe this high of a rate of return, but we may end up having to pay more for the building because somebody else went through the brain damage of developing the property. And so maybe 3.5 is what we had to pay for the property. All right, so let's just sort of see what that means the income would be. Okay, so now, assuming that we're sort of the same entity, and we kind of had the choice, if you will, of developing the property, potentially getting a higher rate of return on whatever we have invested, or buying the property, paying more up front, but probably, you know, in essence, getting a lower rate of return because the market has already sort of priced it at lower risk than developing it. So under this scenario, with these numbers, what we would be saying is, all right, yeah, we're going to be spending less we're going to be, on the development side, we're going to be spending less money, we're going to have a higher rate of risk, but this is going to be our income, whereas over there, we're spending more money to buy the property that's already built, lower overall rate of return, lower income. So in essence, what we're saying is, under this scenario, it's better to be a developer.
The risk is higher, the higher the return.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's
Do you think about the rate of return as risk?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because inherently your rate of return fundamentally is your sort of the risk-free rate plus any sort of risk premium, okay? Plus inflation, plus, you know, all this other, you know, if we want to kind of break it out into component parts, but at the end of the day, it's risk, okay? And so we're just simply saying that you as a developer would have higher risk over here, therefore you would demand a higher rate of return on the amount of money that you are putting into the purchase price of this property, and therefore you're going to get a higher income from it. Whereas over here, yeah, you'd be spending more money up front, but you'd have less risk in the sense of all that development risk that you're pricing out of it, and so therefore you'd only get 5% rate of return and potentially this amount of income. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So with this particular scenario, with this particular set of numbers, it would be beneficial to be the developer.
That's something I never fully understood.
Really?
If my risk is higher, the 7% represents a development stage when the
Really,
building even needs
yeah,
work.
what we're sort of basically saying, the risk premium to be the developer is 2%. 7% minus 5%. So that extra 2% is what we're really sort of compensating ourselves to go through all the brain damage of being a developer of this property. And the question is that extra 2% worth it to us in the sense of the return that we're going to receive in terms of cash flow or relative to the amount that we put into the property? Yep.
What about like say you have this scenario in front of you, just Xing out the development, right? But instead of a development, you put a redevelopment where it's a functioning asset, like let's say
Yep.
a gas station that
Yep.
you can convert to something else. Would you take the same approach?
Yeah, pretty much.
So you would assess the current income versus the potential income.
Yeah.
And assess it.
Yeah, and basically, you could sort of say that maybe this one represents, well, your rate of returns will probably be different. Because here, if you're buying it without renovation, and this represents renovation, because it's more expensive up front, then your cap rate may or may not really change that much. It may change a little bit, because we're dealing with something that's less risk associated with it. But fundamentally, yeah. The question I often get asked is, does it really make sense to renovate a property? You know, sometimes it doesn't. It just makes sense to keep collecting the rent that you're continuing to collect. Because you've got to look at what is the marginal increase in the rent you're going to collect relative to the amount you're going to pay out up front. Let me give you another example that helps illustrate that better. And it's a great question. Think of it like it's sort of from a marginal contribution. And the best example I can sort of think of with relative simplicity, many years ago, there were these massive apartment communities in Texas, and they were trying to do an economic analysis as to whether or not they should build carports on the property. Carports is mean covered parking, okay? Not necessarily a parking garage, but just basically a carport in the sense of you put up a couple of poles and you put up a, kind of a roof. And the only reason to do that was because in Texas you have hailstorms, okay? And it's like golf ball to softball size pieces, chunks of ice, coming down a couple of times, weird random times over the year, and literally will destroy cars, destroy roofs. It's insane. But the point is, people are in many cases willing to spend extra money to keep or to have covered parking. Okay, so it's a little bit different than it is down here in that respect. So, but what they found was that they took a look and they said, okay, how much can we charge somebody on a monthly basis to have covered parking? Okay, and what they found was that people were willing to pay $25 per month to have a covered parking space. Okay, well, what does that translate into per year? 25 times 12, $300 a year. Okay, and they said, okay, what sort of rate of return should we expect on this for whatever it is that we have to spend up front? But what sort of rate of return could we generate off of this? So let's just say that they could generate
4%.
Okay, we'll go with 4%. That's fine. 4%. Okay, so 300 divided by 0.04 is $7,500 per space. Now keep in mind, this is not like the asphalt, concrete. This is just simply a metal structure, going above parking spaces. And so what they figured at the time was that basically the actual cost was like $2,500 per covered parking space. So in essence, $5,000 in value creation for that property as a whole per space. So they're only spending $2,500 per space, but it's creating $7,500 worth of value or 5,000 sort of increase in value. Does that make sense? So under those circumstances, they're like, we'll build covered parking spaces all day and all night, and you know, and people, you know, we're paying for it. The point of this example, you're talking about renovation, that sort of thing, but this is a simple one in the sense that if our cost of renovation is $2,500, you know, you can translate this into like a single family house, you can translate it into an office building, shopping center, whatever you want to translate it into. If your cost of the renovation is $2,500, but it ultimately is translating into an increase in the rent that you're able to achieve on the property, you've got to know what is that increase in the rent that we can charge. But if all of a sudden you go into a house, you put in a new kitchen, you put in an extra bedroom, you put in all this extra stuff, what does that translate into in terms of the rent that you would be able to charge on that property? What sort of rate of return would you have to have? And then what would be the relation between the cost versus then the value creation that came from that renovation? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It does, but I have a question. How do you actually determine that rate of return?
Exactly.
Like, without, like,
Good
making
question.
up
In
the
this
numbers
case-
just to look good?
In this case, you probably are going to have a low rate of return or low cap rate on this particular, you know, item. And cap rate only means capitalization rate. It is what is the rate of return necessary to attract capital to this investment. That's all cap rate really means. So the question is, well, how do you go about setting that cap rate? Well, okay, once again, this gets back to how certain is that income? How stable is that income? Where is that income coming from? What are the credit scores, in one sense, of the people that are paying it? What is the likelihood they're going to use these covered parking spaces? And, you know, because chances are not 100% of the population is going to pay the extra $25 a month, but let's just say 50% of the population of these apartment complexes pay the extra $25 a month to have the covered parking space. Then, you know, what does that really translate into? But, you know, if it's something that has a much higher risk of collecting the funds, a much higher risk of getting it used, a much higher risk of you know, just associated with the income generation aspect of it, then that number would be substantially higher. Does that make sense? Now, in terms of the precision,
No, it does, but it's just like,
But
I
also-
get my head
but
around
also-
like mathematically how you actually
okay,
translate
here's
that
another
to a
one.
number.
Here's another way you could translate it. If you're borrowing the money, this can very well be your cost of borrowing.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a specific
Yeah,
how I
and-
get the number up.
Yeah,
But
and if
it's
you don't
not
have
just like
if you don't have cash money and you want to go out there and you get a loan,
Yeah.
and let's assume that you can get a loan at 4%,
that makes
then this
sense.
thing makes money all day and all night.
Oh. Got it.
Okay, because you're basically going to get a loan on $2,500,
Yeah. But I'm getting it.
but it's going to generate income that basically supports a value or a loan 3 times that amount.
Okay.
This is a very low risk thing. It's like is it something that will be built on a owner's property, or would they have it like downtown parking where you can get covered parking versus open air parking? Is that the idea?
Partially, yes. I mean, all we're saying is there is a marginal value that is being created here, and that marginal value, in this case, is the $5,000. We're simply saying it costs you this much to build, but after you're done building it, it's actually worth this. So the marginal value is $5,000, or in essence, excess profit, however you want to kind of phrase it.
Is it wrong to just take the cap rate of the property?
Yes, in some cases.
It's wrong to do that?
Sometimes. Because this may or may not have less risk in the overall property. Like for example, using my example, if only half of the people are using this, you only build half of them, you don't build for 100%, you build half, then you're sort of, hoping that that in and of itself will sort of reduce the risk. In other words, if you were to build 100% of these for the entire property, then you're sort of taking the risk that a lot of them are going to be unused. And therefore you're not going to be generating income off of them. And then you've got an issue of, well, where these other people are going to park, they don't have covered parking. So that would be a higher risk.
Because that income would add a lot of value to the property.
Yes, oh absolutely. That is the point.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So like you would take that 5,000, add it to the income, and then you would divide it by the cap rate of the property.
This is what I'm saying. This alone could add hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars in some cases, to the underlying value of the property, just simply because you found something that is an extraneous income source. Because a lot of people, now if you just included covered parking with the rent, people don't really fully appreciate that. It's only whenever you back it out in a a la carte sort of method that then people begin to say, oh, I want covered parking. I don't want to have uncovered parking. I'm willing to pay more to have the covered parking. And they're willing to do so. Okay?
And when your neighbor
go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, when your neighbor gets the car wrecked, then you just laugh at him.
He'll start.
I mean, there are, emotions and pricing and how you go about pricing and what you go about disclosing or not disclosing and, all this information. Some people are very rational decision makers and take in all the information, out there and available, and, will make all the comparisons between a property that offers free covered parking versus not free covered parking. But other people will just, it's just not something that factors into their sort of, way of thinking. My perfect example of this are utility costs, okay? I have seen situations, especially with renovated properties that were energy inefficient buildings, like older buildings specifically. Whenever I was doing some of the renovations I was doing in Texas of some of these older buildings, I always took a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of extra care to ensure the buildings were well insulated and ultimately the windows and everything was sealed to the point of where they were going to be very energy efficient, okay? But I had to pay more money up front as the basically redeveloper of those properties to make that happen. One of my competitors that had a property literally across the street didn't do that. Okay, just slapped on some air conditioning, to the property, didn't really do a fair job of insulating, had these ridiculously high ceilings with no insulation, and it was like for the same size unit, my unit would have a utility bill on a monthly basis of let's say $100 a month, and his, it would be like $400 a month for the same unit. Okay, for the utility bill, because you're burning up, air conditioning in the summer and, 110 degree, weather in Texas. But yet, at the beginning of this, somebody would take a look at the two properties and say, well, mine's priced a little bit higher per month, for rent than what his was. And so maybe they'd initially lease with him. In a couple cases, I got his tenants because they were like, our utility bills are insane. I can pay you a little bit more in rent and have just as nice of a place, but yet my utility bill is not going to be that much. But they didn't think about it going into it, or didn't investigate it, or didn't, whatever. But my point is, those are, things that it fits into the same framework. Okay, I figured that I could spend a little bit more money up front on making the property more energy efficient, and hopefully be able to generate a little bit more in extra rent. Sometimes people will see that, sometimes they won't. Make sense? Okay. Other questions?
These things relate to a specific market. Because
sure they do.
If you are looking, say, in the United States, where utility cost is cheap compared to other countries, you're gonna get why go green?
Right. No. And you're absolutely right. There are certain parts of the country where, like specifically, In the Pacific Northwest, where you have a lot of the electricity that's generated by hydropower, you know, their utility costs are ridiculously cheap.
I've got a niece who tells me in Canada,
Right.
hydro is cheap. I said, well, anyway.
Yeah, no, it is.
I said, no, they said, she said hydro is free electricity, because I thought they meant something else when she said hydro. But she said hydro is free, electricity is free. So in that case, you would not have the need to go stuff like that. But if you are in a country like Kenya, for example, or Jamaica, where electricity cost is high and it's unreliable, then you definitely want to go solar and things like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. All right. Any other questions on this before we move on? All right. Do we take a quick break? Okay. 5-minute break. Come back. It's 9:40, so come back at 9:45-ish.
Last time glasses.
You can't see?
No.
That's convenient.
Yes, so you get 145 in construction cost. This is debt. Yeah, this is sales. So why is 10 and not 45?
Yeah, I don't think that's the right answer.
Yes, sir. Well, yeah, I'm not going to ask you what is the negative interest. I'm going to maybe ask you like, maybe the total cost of borrowing or something like that.
Oh,
that's that one should have been here, right? Yeah, that's what
Yes.
Right.
You have to have an inflow to match the outflow.
Okay, that's what I thought.
He calculates for 12 years.
Yeah, they weren't
Then
matching.
per month. And then he gets this number. And then he gets the 1.5 here. Right? And then
That's what it was.
he comes and takes this number for 7. Why don't he does it all together to the end? Like for 12. Instead of 5 and 7.
I understand, especially in this part.
So if you did it all at once, it would be the same.
Yeah.
Let's see. Monthly. You know, I thought it was yearly, so I was calculating, I didn't get any of the numbers. Okay, now I get it. So it's, Aaron,
Right now, what it is.
hello.
Yeah, I should do that.
I'm not sure if the feeling is mutual. I was kidding.
Yeah, that's on Thursday.
Yeah, I think she's getting ready to have some sort of a graduation party or something. She said something about something to send it to all the alumni and everybody, so.
She's part of the alumni.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What did we say this one was? This was the income, this is the sale.
At the beginning, you mentioned something about the very beginning about merchant.
This one, the 8.
So that would be somewhat disconnected.
Yeah, merchant builder is just basically, it's kind of like a retail builder, that they're going to come in, they're going to build it, and they're going to sell it. Sometimes they get it occupied, sometimes they just sell it empty,
Which ones
sometimes.
you don't have to build, what if you could.
Wasn't that
All your buildings, how do
You can call yourself, you can still call yourself a developer, you're just sort of like a pre-developer.
you know, sell like towns to someone
Yeah.
else? Yeah, we could, something like that, we
It's
could
gonna
approve
close
first.
to borrow down.
Yeah, you basically get everything entitled, ready to go, and then you turn it off to
I think
somebody
that's
else.
like 4 towers, and it's all, change the whole thing, you wanna go 2 towers, they go.
Yeah, because in one sense, the value creation there is that they've gone through the brain damage of getting all the entitlements, and now it's ready to not have that risk.
Yeah, like the first day. I don't want to do it. Now it's easy. From you just have to like follow all this. It's a lot of steps.
Absolutely.
It's simple. Okay, I got it. Yeah, yeah.
And different people are good at different things, and so like somebody may be really good at getting things through the approval process, but horrific in managing a construction process. Totally different, skill set.
What's the size of the cover, was that number 7 right now?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, but it'll give you the resolution of the duration. So first feature land was this, right? Then you do additional. Oh, that came from 5. Oh, that's right. Okay. Interest rate paid off this amount. It's the same step, but you have to occupy early here. Right. And this you just calculate for the end result, right? Okay. Thanks. Somebody will look at it and analyze it.
That's a future project, so that will.
Right.
No.
Thank you. No, this is, that's construction. They do or do not? Yeah.
Oh, Kenny, by the way, you didn't obviously get the email I sent you back about the.
Oh, I did, I just.
No, what I shared, that was probably going that much further. I need to mention that, remind me, but, that's gonna be coming up February the 15th.
So this is sales.
So after,
This is sales.
the law class, the alumni are putting on that section, all of that, for your replacement, and bringing several people to sort of talk about specific ways to kind of prepare yourself.
Okay. Well,
This is
yeah,
just land
I saw it,
products of interest.
reading it last night, I was just busy.
But
I wanted to
this
ask,
was
in the book, they were talking about development, right?
Down one.
And
was
he
a
had said
construction
at the end,
cost.
in the
You add
budget
up-
part,
you add up
where
those numbers.
if you're a developer, it's less risky to develop than to
How did you just be on that?
And he came to that assumption.
Well, no, I think it was saying it's more risky to develop, but at the same time, that's why you sign like a higher.
Everybody come in, they laugh and file, and pop bottles, and then call all your friends over and throw all the
And
bigger.
we always caution, development is a risky business, and it's a higher risk.
Really,
The
I've
way
been
that
part
he
of it for
phrased
10
it was
years, and
almost
I'm
like
not appreciating
it was
it.
less risky to.
I'd rather be the guy that comes by every once in a while, enjoys it a little, and then he makes millions in the back end.
What stages, if you take the project
Sales
from
finance.
conception of the idea all the way through full occupancy, that's.
I just did boxes
we're
for
fully
everything.
development. You may only be doing one piece of it, like they were sort of talking about, you may have a developer that was doing pre-development work, getting all the entitlements, getting, all the regulatory stuff out of the way.
You don't make them fun, but you know,
Then, not bring that all, construction side, and
Yeah, and that's like
title
just,
for so many stories of this density.
there's a higher discount rate.
Next guy.
They pay.
Yeah, it's different.
Hey, hey.
The only part about the development is
Let's go in Mark.
I think you're just extracting out some of the risk.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
everybody has their skill set. Your skill set may be
Well, now.
taking the property once it's been built,
Well, higher the discount
renovating
rate
it
with the
enhancing value. Whereas somebody else, they're much better at actually taking it from putting the well in and actually.
All the recommendations were like,
Construction.
I was like, what?
This is like what, net present
I
value?
guess overall,
Yeah.
he's good at everything.
Yeah.
This is just like equity.
Or, that's not good at all, but.
Oh, yeah, now it's, very inappropriate.
I mean, you can carve out different niches, you only are gonna do this type of development, you may only do like developing build to suit, where you have a tenant already in hand, that you're building for, so there's no risk of occupancy. Yeah, it's just things are gonna occupy.
I don't know.
Been
That's
built.
what I wanna know. I just followed that. I just read the chapter all the time. This one, right? So you take going in, and that's yeah, so that was,
but I started the first week was like 8.
oh, right. Yeah, this was developed in the back of your house.
Not really, but the last one I think
Oh, it's one upstairs.
You guys.
like
Okay.
You apparently have some leftover food up there.
I had a lot of leftover food.
I don't know how that goes.
Okay. So,
It's all out of the country.
we've got like 4 more questions to kind of go through, 3 of which are sort of from the handouts, number 3 and the number 4. Okay, everybody obviously had a copy of this at some point from the first day. Well, you don't necessarily have to have them right now. No. As long as you've got them somewhere. Okay. Hopefully you took some time to kind of work through those a little bit and see a little bit better, in some cases, how to use the financial calculator and kind of how to set things up, and obviously several examples within there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a couple of problems that are obviously contained within there and kind of work through those, and then those will be sort of representative of the kind of questions that you're going to have on the little quiz. So let's just do that. All right, so let's just say we've got the following variables. We've got a purchase price. We've got carrying cost per year, and I'll talk about that. We've got a projected sale price. We've got an anticipated holding period. And we want to calculate basically internal rate of return and also basically either net present value or the overall purchase price. Given a required rate of return. Okay, all right. So those are the variables. So let's populate the variables with some numbers. All right. So let's just do kind of a comparison. We've got a project A, we've got a project B. Okay. So, and this is assuming a property that is already built, and so we're acquiring it. What is our purchase price? Give me a dollar amount for project A.
5 million.
5 million. Okay. Give me a purchase price for project B.
7 million.
Okay. Now the second one we haven't talked about in here. This is carrying cost per year. What this typically relates to is the expenses that you incur as the owner of the property, and it may be that this is a piece of raw land, okay? Could be you bought the raw land for 5 million, you bought another piece for 7 million, but the carrying cost should be things like property taxes, okay? Could be insurance, so if somebody slips and falls or gets hurt on the property, you know, are covered there. Could be maybe security, that if you know, once again, you've got this piece of land, you know, you maybe have it monitored, some sort of security service, whatever. But carrying costs are just gonna be out-of-pocket expenses that you're gonna have in terms of owning this property while you own it. Does that make sense? So in this case, let's just say it's raw, like to keep things simple. All right, so we buy it for these respective purchase prices. That's going to be an outflow. Your carrying costs are also going to be an outflow. So how much per year? Give me a dollar amount for this first one.
1%.
Okay, so we're going to say like $50,000. Okay. Okay. You want to do 1% over here too, or you want to do something different?
Let's go 1.5.
No, I'm not going to pull the calculator. Okay. 7,000 times 0.015, 105,000. Okay. Now, let's do the holding period before we do the sale price. So how many years do we plan on owning this or holding this property?
10 years.
Okay, for A. 10 years. Okay, for what about B?
7.
Okay, 7 years. All right, now, at the end of 10 years, how much do we project that we're going to be able to sell it for?
7 million.
Okay. Oh, I put some more put. Okay. What about for B?
7 million again.
You want to say 7 million again?
No.
I said 9 million.
We've done that.
I mean, no money.
9 million.
7 years.
Okay. Now, let's, before we do the other calculations, let's just kind of do just what I would sort of call a very simple, sort of almost like sniff test. All right. So in this case, we're selling it for 7 million. We bought it for 5 million. That basically, just on that, is a $2 million capital gain. But we have $50,000 a year of carrying cost. Well, $50,000 a year times 10 years, that's 500,000. So basically, the simple way to sort of think about this one is you've got 7 million minus 5 million minus 500,000. Okay, so you're left with
1.5.
okay. And I'm just doing that just so that once again you kind of have it in your brain as to okay, that is in one sense just in terms of raw dollars the amount. Okay, over here just do the same thing. Okay, I want you to do it this time.
It's 1.265.
So. Yep. 1,265,000. Okay? All good? That make sense to everybody?
That makes sense.
Okay, now, so what we want to do is to calculate the internal rate of return, basically take into account the timing of these cash flows in terms of when they're being paid out, when they're being received, over what period of time, and allowing the calculator to basically do the math to sort of say, if I bought it for this, I had carrying cost of this, I sold it for this, and I have this long of a holding period, what is my rate of return? Okay, so what we're going to do, basically, calculator's going to be set to one payment per year because these are annual cash flows. kind of clear everything out. Okay, and let's just, we can actually, one way we could do it is kind of go from the left to the right. We can go any way we want to in terms of the ordering of these. When I say left to the right, on the top row of the calculator, basically is what I'm saying, is that we can sort of start with the term. What's our term?
10.
So 10 in. Okay, next item on the calculator is present value, or I'm sorry, interest rate. Interest rate, well, that we're solving for that, so we don't need to put that one in. So next one is the present value. That's what we paid for it.
$5 million.
And we're going to put that in as a negative. So that's what we paid for it. Okay? Then holding cost is going to be our payment. So our holding cost on an annual basis was what?
$50,000.
$50,000. So $50,000 is going to be a negative payment. Okay? Then future value is going to be, well, what are we selling it for?
$7 million.
$7 million. That's going to be a positive because that is positive income. Okay?
0.56.
So based on that, we can solve for the interest rate, or in this case, it's the internal rate of return. Let's see what we get. Not great. 2.56%. Okay? Not too many of us would be overly satisfied with that as a rate of return. Okay? Really low. Probably wouldn't cover our cost of borrowing. Okay, so not necessarily a great investment. Okay, let's take a look at the other one.
That's it.
Okay? Same process. Okay, what's our term on this one? 7 years. Okay, how much did we spend?
$7 million.
Okay, what's our annual holding cost?
$105,000.
And then we sold it for $9 million?
Correct. I got to point three.
Okay. Okay, let's see what we get. Even worse. 2.31%.
Bad numbers.
Okay, so one way we can interpret this is, number one, it's probably not a project we want to pursue at that price and with those basically details. So what if we were to turn this around in a little bit of a different direction and we were to say, okay, yeah, this is what we expect as our term. Yeah, these are going to be our holding costs. Yeah, here's how much we're going to potentially sell it for. But we kind of work backwards into how much should we really pay for this if we want some sort of a potential rate of return. Like we want, in other words, this is horrible, horrible, bad return. But we want something better than that. What sort of rate of return do we want?
10%.
10%. Okay, so what we could do, in both instances, if we said that our hurdle rate or our required rate were 10%, we can put in 10% as the interest rate, then solve for present value, and that would tell us how much we could really afford to spend up front to buy the property to give us that 10% rate of return. Does that make sense? And in essence, do the same thing for both. If we had a 10% rate of return requirement over here, now if you already cleared your calculator out, you got to put in everything all over again. But if you haven't cleared your calculator out, you can just go forward. Like on the second one, which I haven't put my calculator out, so I just put in 10%. resolve for present value. And what that tells me is I can afford to spend $4,107,239 and basically 9 cents rounded, instead of $7 million. If I want to get a 10% rate of return. Okay, now you figured out over here for the other property.
I got 2.391574.
Okay.
Is carrying cost included debt?
In this case, we're making the assumption no debt. We're just saying that the carrying cost is just basically holding cost of like property taxes, insurance, that sort of stuff.
Does an IRR require debt?
No.
Really?
No.
Sure, now you're talking lever now.
Okay, over here, 2,391,574, 67 versus 5 million. So what we're able to do here, you can twist and turn this a whole bunch of different ways, but in essence what we're sort of saying is, if this is what the property is currently priced at by the owner of the property, and our assumptions are we're going to hold it for 10 years, we've got this in holding cost, and we think we can sell it for this at some point in the future, and we demand a 10% rate of return on whatever we invest in, that's the most we can spend on the property in order to achieve that. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Yes.
And then the same thing, obviously, for the other property. Okay?
Based on resale?
Based on the resale, and based upon the holding cost, based upon the term.
Well, because you're
Because
not.
if you change any of those, it changes the overall amount that you would have to pay.
But you're not accounting for the income, right?
No, this example, whenever I made it up, we were sort of saying it's raw land.
Oh, okay.
So it's just raw land that we own, outright. Okay? Okay? We good with that?
Now, is there any underlying assumptions with this raw land? Like maybe you can develop it for X?
No, I mean, in this case, all you're really saying is, I'm just going to buy it, hold it for 10 years, and then expect to sell it for, obviously, more than what I paid for it. Here, this is an interesting thing about land speculation. There are those folks that is their type of sort of development, is really buying raw land, that they think is in a growth pattern for a particular area, region, because they're saying, okay, here is a map of the existing city, and the growth is headed toward the north, and so therefore I'm going to buy up as much land along major intersections, in that growth corridor, and I'm going to sit on it for 10 years, 15 years, whatever it takes to then be able to sell it off at a nice tidy profit to someone else to build housing or retail or office or whatever it might be. But that's their whole game, is just a long-term hold. And hopefully they're, in their mind, hopefully they're able to cash in on that. The problem with that is for every year that you hold that property, you've got to get that much higher of a sale price in order to justify the hold. Because, and just, once again, simple time is money, in the sense that for example, let's just use this as a case in point. Well, I've already cleared everything out. So I'm going to go back. Okay. Put in all the details all over again. 50,000. Okay, so we get that. We get the 10%, we get the 2391. Okay, so I'm assuming that I'm starting here, okay, with changing up some assumptions. So instead of holding this thing for 10 years, let's say, so let's say instead of 10 years, I'm going to have to hold it an extra 5 years, 15 years. So 15 in. Now, let's resolve for the present value.
All right,
At
10%.
10%?
Yeah. Wow. So that basically is saying that property is worth that much less to me in terms of a purchase if I'm gonna have to hold on to it for 5 more years, okay? Let's just say that instead of 15 years, let's say it's more like a whole generational hold of like 30 years.
Maybe like $40.
Well, no.
Not quite, but yeah, you're getting
like
you're sort of
almost
$30.
$11. Good God.
Down
Okay.
from 5 million.
So let's say you hold it in your family for 50 years.
Now it's going down.
Whoops, I must have pushed something wrong, hold on. 50 in. Okay, I'm sorry, I think I pushed something wrong. 436, 1110 here, so 30 years was what, hold on.
So then 30 was wrong.
30 years should be,
7 times.
how's that right?
You're going down.
Oh, duh, okay. Basically, after it crosses over, in other words, this is actually, somebody would have to almost pay me that amount of money to actually own it for that long. Because of the holding cost, you're basically losing money, is what it's saying. You can't, you'd have to pay somebody to buy the property.
Yeah, 'cause you're-
Yeah, that's what I was just like, whoa, wait a second, that could be right. So let's just say 40 years, see what it shows up.
it's on 0.
So you have to be very aware of the holding costs.
Yeah. It's all because of the holding cost.
That makes sense.
But in any event, all I'm wanting to say is this. The longer you hold the property, you know, the less the value that you would be willing to pay up front for the property because of those holding costs and whatever rate of return that you, if you're wanting to generate, in this case, a 10% rate of return, it may not be possible. Okay? Because here's what
Well, you're hoping
here's what
that in
happens,
30
and
years you're gonna
this
be able to
you,
sell a lot more.
yeah, I saw this constantly, you know, in Texas with farmland. You'd have somebody and say, oh, this is a family farm. Oh, you know, grandpa bought this thing for $10,000, you know, whatever, 20 years ago, and he sold it for 10 times that, for $100,000. Well, you know, you instantly think, oh my God, that's amazing. But then, you know, you actually look at what the rate of return is, it's not that great. I mean, let's just humor myself on this. Let's just do just that. Okay, so 1 penny per year.
It's a place to park your money. You don't want to think about it, you know. It's not the best, but
You bought it for $10,000.
This is just a,
Yeah, it's a raw piece of raw land. You bought it for $10,000. That was what you bought it for. You sold it for $100,000, 10 times the amount. You held it for 10 years. What, in essence, was the rate of return on that?
Ongoing costs.
And in this case, we're going to assume no holding costs. Just I want to just keep a very simple little clean problem. So 10,000, 100,000, 10% or 10. I'm sorry, 10 years. Rate of return, not bad in that particular case, 25%. But 25% is not 10 times. You well, what I'm saying? Okay. 10,000, 100,000. 100,000 is 10 times what you paid for it. You would think that would be, you know, close to the rate of return, but it's not because you had to hold on to it for 10 years.
so
But now if you held on to it for 5 years,
is that just time value?
yes, totally, time value. So if you only held it for 5 years, your rate of return jumps
58.
to 58%. If you held it for 1 year,
That's when you're good.
Exactly. And you're gonna go.
900%. Because you bought it at the beginning of the year, you sold it at the end of the year, you got literally 10 times what you put into it, or in essence a 900% rate of return.
The holding cost on the other one that we did, we put in as a payment. Is that a payment every year?
Yes. In that case, it's a payment out, not a payment in.
I didn't know if the calculator was doing that every single year.
Yes, it is. Okay. But my point with this is just, a simple example that, once again, you buy it at the beginning of the year, you sell it at the end of the year, it's a 900% rate of return. But if you have to hold on to it for 5 years, it goes into 58, hold it for 10 years, it goes down to 25%. I mean, once again, you kind of keep up, if you hold it for, let's go back to 50 years. Yeah, you're down to 4.7.
This could be applied to rental property though too.
Yeah.
Like if you hold it forever, your rate of return might go down, but you still get cash flow. So
You still get cash flow, but this is land.
Yeah.
And with land, there's potentially no income.
Yeah.
Unless you've got cows grazing on it, or oil wells, or something else that you might have in Texas. Okay, moving on. Okay, we've got one more
If you buy
there.
land for 10,000 and you hit an oil.
It's a whole different thing. Okay, so that gets us through questions 8 and 9. Now then, question 10.
In our law and ethics class, Weissman was telling us that I forget the guy's first name, but Davey, he came here and he just bought up all of Davey, and he just bought raw land, and now clearly everyone knows who he is, or his name at least. Which is interesting. I guess it's just like a time period. Huh? Yeah, his last name is Davey, so all the land he owns. I guess that's just like a, back in the day, there was just a lot of opportunity that's not really available now.
That is very true.
You have to go like a where there's absolutely nothing.
Yeah, but you can go to somewhere like Austin,
There
where
wasn't
it's
one.
slowly building out, and in 20 years, it's gonna be like.
But I mean, like, it's so risky.
No.
Why?
Like for Florida.
In Florida, yeah, but Austin,
Okay.
Texas.
Yeah, I don't know shit about that. I don't know shit about that.
All right, so question 10, basically, let's just say that we've got a property and the cash flows for over 5 years, and what we want to know is basically how much should we pay for the property here, assuming these cash flows plus some sort of reversion value, okay? So we need to figure out what our cash flows are, and then our sale price or our reversion at the end of that 5 years, all right? So, and then we also want to know our rate of return. So we need to know what sort of rate of return do we want Okay, so let's fill in the blanks. You're going to need some numbers. Okay, first of all, what rate of return do we want on an investment? Give me a percentage.
10%.
How much?
10.
Everybody goes with 10. All right, 10 is rate of return. All right, now let's go with the cash flows from the property. Now, the cash flows can be the same, cash flows can be different. Let's make the cash flows different each year. So give me a dollar amount for year one. 50,000. Okay, cash flow for year two, something higher or lower?
75,000.
This is money coming in?
Yes, money coming in.
65.
Okay. This is class participation at its best. Okay? All right. 80.
85.
And 85. Okay, so we got a nice little, unsteady sort of cash flow here. We kind of go up, we go down, we go up again. So, okay, that's our cash flow stream. Now, at the end of all of this, we know we can sell it for a certain dollar amount. So give me a dollar amount we're going to be able to sell it for. Now it's going to be obviously something greater than, $1 million. Okay, let's go with $1 million. What the heck? All right, so there's the setup in terms of the givens. Now you need to solve for what is the value there. All right, figure it out. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple minutes. You can work with your neighbor.
You know how to do it? Alright. And then,
And once again, this is contained within the handouts. So you should already know how to do this if you did what I asked to do and kind of review the handouts. Or you can refer back.
Carrying costs per year,
First, I
right?
have to make sure that I do
So,
the,
yeah, not just the first
No?
carrying, well, they're all different.
But how do you input payments for different units?
we do FJ,
Oh, so you put like one and then you put NV. Okay.
subsidiary, this cash flow,
First, I have to start with the numbers 5
and
and
the number.
and then can you start with first CPF?
Yeah, first have to put the cash flow and put the,
So put like what the first number? 50,000 was that? And
Yeah, to figure out the land value, right?
no,
CPS
yeah, just the, here, that's,
0. I don't know the 0.
zero. Yeah, because it starts at 0.
I don't think I know how to do. I can do this.
I'm just gonna guess.
So it could come from that person.
We're trying to do that.
That's right.
Where are we? Okay, here it goes.
This one's for that list. 37. It was good for 37.
Okay, how do you think you got it?
You got smashed.
Anybody think they have the answer?
I'll give it a shot. Give me. I got 884
And then they should.
614.
Okay, 884-614?
Yes.
Okay, let's see if that's right. All right. So, here's how you're going to set this up. One payment per year. Okay, clear everything out. All right. Then we're going to put in 0 as our initial cash flow. Okay. Then you're going to put in 50,000 as a cash flow, 75,000 as a cash flow, 65,000 as a cash flow, 80,000. And then for our final cash flow, this is the part where sometimes people get screwed up, is you put the 85,000 plus the 1 million equals, and then whatever that equals then becomes your final cash flow, because those two things are happening simultaneously. You're in essence receiving that at the same time you're receiving that. Okay? So we add those two together. Then we put in our required rate of return, 10% as our interest rate. Then we solve for net present value, and that would be our answer. So let's see what we get.
It's like if I inputted all everything properly.
Yeah.
All right, and I get 884, 614, 19. Does that match up with what Kenny gave me?
Yep.
Yep. Ooh, Kenny gets a gold star for today. All right.
Extra credit.
Okay, does that make sense, everybody?
And net present value is always pertaining to the cash flow.
Yeah, in this case, all the net present value is just, it's simply saying that is the amount that we could afford to spend upfront and still generate our 10% rate of return. Now, Another way of kind of just looking at this just from the standpoint of the cash flows themselves, you know, we basically have 50,000 plus 75 plus 65 plus 80 plus 85, and that gives us 335,000 plus the 1 million, so a total income of 1,335,000. But what we're saying is because we demand a 10% rate of return or discount on whatever income is coming in, then we're willing to only pay that amount. But if we kind of go back here for a second, and we were to put in 0 as our discount rate or our required rate of return, and we solve for net present value.
What does that mean? That means
hold please. All right. So what that would mean is, in that case, what you should see.
The same number.
Because what you're saying there is you're not discounting, you're not putting any sort of risk associated with that income, therefore you're not demanding any sort of rate of return. You're simply saying, give me exactly the amount of money back that I'm putting into it, okay? And if the cash flows are totaling 1,335,000, then that's saying, all right, I would spend no more than that, and I would get a 0% rate of return. I'm not getting anything, I'm getting back what I put into it. That's it. So therefore, I'm not getting a rate of return, I'm getting back what I put into it. With a 0% rate of return, required rate of return. But because I'm requiring a 10% rate of return, that means this income is not worth as much as it is with a 0% discount rate. With a 10% discount rate, it's worth 884. The higher that I make my required rate of return, the lower this number becomes. In other words, it's the same exact logic as the ERV model. In other words, this is, in essence, the value. This is saying I'm getting a 0% rate of return for whatever income that I'm receiving.
So if you wanted a 10%, I thought basically NPV was like if it's above 1, then you want to do the deal, or above 0, you want to do the deal. It's not giving you a price to solve, you know.
That is one way to look at it. Okay, what you're describing, okay, where the net present value equals 0 is where, in essence, that is your internal rate of return. Okay, like for example.
Like if it was 0, add 10%, then we have a 10% IRR.
If we were to put in, we can't, it's not an easy way of doing this. Okay, let me do it this way. Let's say that we put in 15% as the IRR. What's going to happen whenever we solve for net present value is going to go down. Okay, what does it go down to? Anybody?
728.04.
And you're using IRR and discount rate interchangeably now, though.
To a certain extent, yes.
That's
okay. All right. So do this for me, Kenny. Put in solve for the internal rate of return. No, oh, that's right. We can't do it because we have 0 as our initial, so
yeah,
it won't do it. Okay.
It's been giving me no solution when I
okay. All right. So do 20%. What do we get as our net present value? It should just keep going down.
Okay. 605,983.
So what's going to happen is as we keep increasing that rate of return more and more, then our net present value gets less and less, meaning we're going to pay less and less for the property because we're demanding a higher and higher rate of return for the property. In other words, it's the same exact logic as the ERV model. That, in other words, this is just simply saying, okay, yeah, that's the sort of the value, yeah, that's sort of the cap rate, and the income is whatever the income is.
No, it makes sense. Before we were looking at it the way I was describing, which is NPV is normally like around zero, or, and I don't, like, now it's like completely different.
It is, and the reason is because here we have set the initial cash outflow as 0. In other words, we haven't, in other words, instead of saying we did pay this for the property, here we're saying, what do we pay for this property? Or what should we pay for this property? Based upon the income stream it's generating.
Okay, so same thing basically.
Yeah. Okay, moving forward. Okay, then we got one more thing, and then it's almost time for the quiz. Okay. Okay, so one thing before I got one more problem, and then we'll do the quiz. So before I forget, mark this on your calendars. Hello, mark this on your calendars. So February the 15th, which is obviously a couple of weeks from now or so, 2 or 3 weeks, whatever it is, on Saturday, after the law class finishes up at 4:30 in the afternoon, the alumni are putting together another event for all of you. And this one's going to be focused on job placement, okay? So they're bringing in a number of alumni, they're bringing in some recruiters, they're basically bringing in a variety of people that are all going to potentially be helpful to answer a lot of questions and kind of give you some advice and pointers on obviously finding employment within the real estate development arena. They're going to be, the only reason they haven't sent it out yet, they're still finalizing a couple of the people that they're inviting to this, but in essence, they should have about 5 different sort of panelists. They're going to be talking about things, and what we'll do, like we did the last event last semester, it will be in one of the rooms here in the building. We'll serve, obviously, beer and wine along with some appetizers, that sort of thing. So, and it will probably go from like 4:30 until, let's say, maybe 6. So put it on your calendars, February the 15th. While it is not a required thing, strongly encourage it simply because it's for your own best interest, okay? All right, moving forward. All right.
You have to add this, the equals, and then.
Because he saves everything.
Yes.
In this case, we're calling it, yeah, revenue problem. All right. Okay. So one of the things that your text went through was this whole thing of applying a financing discount rate to a set of cash flows and a revenue discount rate to a set of cash flows. Now, the financing sort of discount rate, this was, in essence, the money that you're spending to obviously finance your development or finance your project. The revenue discount rate was, in essence, the revenues coming in from the sale of the project. So this is kind of going back to the very first example that we did today. We're going to kind of approach it a little bit different. All right? On the financing side of things, the assumption is it is going to be at a lower discount rate than the revenue discount rate, which is going to be at a higher. Okay, in order to come up with, in essence, a present value for this. Now, in your text, just for those of you that are kind of wanting to sort of look at a specific example that they came up with, just to kind of point you out to the page, you can look at it if you want to. This, in essence, is looking at page 166 in and then following over a couple of pages later, on page 170, as they are calculating basically the net present value for a project with these sort of mixed cash flows. Now, in the book, I think they use like 3% and maybe 7%. So what the heck, we'll use the same ones. 3% and 7%. 3% meaning the financing discount rate, and the idea there is that your financing of the project, in their mind, less risky cash flows in terms of discounting them back, whereas the revenue, more risky, and applying a higher discount rate to. Now, here's kind of one way to sort of set it up. Let's say that we're going to say the first 6 months all right, we're going to apply a discount rate of 3%, and then we're going to apply a discount rate of 7% to the revenue side. And so what they did was, in essence, saying, okay, let's say that we've got whatever the expenses are to actually build the property, that sort of thing. And so let's just kind of keep this simple. Let's just say we've got $10 million a month. It's a big project. All right, so let's start with that. But here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be calculating the present value of this to get, in essence, a net present value calculation. So let's start. This is going to be 12 payments per year because it's monthly. Clear everything out. All right, and then we're going to put in 3% as the interest rate. You're going to put in 10 million as your payment, and then all these are going to be negatives. So you can put 10 million as a negative payment, and then you're going to solve for, I'm sorry, in this case 6 months is the term. Then you're going to solve for what is the present value. So start with that piece of it.
$59 million. 478.
Yep. Okay, you good with that? Okay, now, so we sort of make the assumption that for the last half of the year, we're getting all the income coming in. And in this case, let's say that we are getting 11 million a month. Oops, that's going to be positive. So 11 million a month for 6 months. Okay, so here, clear everything out. 7% as our discount rate. 11 million as a positive payment. 6 months. Solve for present value.
$64,673,000.
Payments.
Okay.
64 is what you said?
Yep.
64, 673, 189. Okay, but we're not quite done yet, because what that does is it calculates what is the value of that as of right there. Okay, because it's discounting it back to that point. So what we need to do, kind of like we did on that first problem, is to now sort of continue on, clear all, take the 64,673,189, make that our future value, discount it by 6 more months at the 7%, get our present value. And we end up with 62, 455, 132. Okay, so that's our discounted income. Our discounted expenses are 59. So to find the net present value for these, we would just simply take the 62 million, 455, 132, subtract out the 59, 478, 480, round it off. So the net present value on this particular project, 2976, 652. Now, the reason why we had to kind of break it up into the steps that we did and not just simply do a normal sort of net present value is because we're applying 2 different discount rates. One to the expense side or the financing side, and one to the income side, basically saying that the income side, it's occurring further in the future, but it's also potentially more risk in terms of us getting it because these are sales, whereas this is more certain and it's known to us, and it's obviously closer to the present. So given those assumptions, what we end up with then is a net present value of 2976. Now what your textbook author was trying to argue was this. That's the reason for doing this calculation. He was basically saying that if you were to apply the same discount rate to the financing side as you do to the income side, that what that's going to do is that's going to, in essence, make the financing side weaker, or in essence, a smaller dollar amount, and what that would do is, in essence, inflate the net present value. Basically make the property or the property look more profitable or more valuable than what it actually is. That was his whole point, okay, in doing this. And so it was just a more conservative way of addressing this, which apply a lower discount rate to your expenses and a higher discount rate to your income, and therefore you hopefully then end up with a more conservative estimate of what the net present value is for the property. Yes?
Isn't that in theory saying that it's less risky to develop than to just take in cash? Because you're discounting that a little.
It's simply saying, to a certain extent, that the financing dollars that you're going to use to finance this project, those are more certain than the income numbers are from the actual sales of the units or whatever that come later. That's all it's really saying.
So the security of where your cash is coming from That's the only factor that you're taking in when you're doing this assessment. You have a guaranteed loan versus, you don't know if you're gonna sell it.
So you're saying yes.
So, well, why are you discounting, like, you borrowing something?
Because you're sort of saying that once again, those are all dollar amounts that you're gonna be spending in the future. They're not all happening here at time period 0. If they're all happening at time period 0, you wouldn't discount them at all.
Could that be like a project you are developing, but the lender says instead of paying me at the end of the project, you can pay now?
To a certain extent, yeah. But I think that the lesson that I'm trying to, and I think what he was simply trying to convey and trying to follow along with kind of what he is suggesting. I have never done it quite like this. I've actually done it a little bit differently, and we can talk about that, but what he is simply trying to articulate in this is that if we had discounted the financing cost at a much higher rate, or 7%, what that would do, well, let's just see.
And does that mean we're trying to get a 10% return on the whole project?
No. Okay, so we kind of go back over to this for a second. Okay. So we put in 3%, 10 million, I'm sorry, we put in, no. Instead of 3%, we put in 7%.
Yeah, and you do it all by 7%. See how much it is.
Okay.
Yeah, see the difference.
So it changes this to 58 million.
Actually lowers the.
Right, which it lowers
Lowers the cost.
but it lowers the cost, but then it inflates.
Inflates the NPV, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So if you take the 62 million and you subtract out 58 million,
Yeah, lowers.
so
So depending what side you're looking at it.
so instead of the net present value being 2.9 million, using this approach of saying it's 3.6 million, in other words, inflating what the value or the profitability of the project is what it's basically doing.
But you're saying that you want to get a 7% return, so you're discounting the cash flows of 11 million by 7%. But why would you're not making money on the financing, so I don't get that.
All you're doing here is, this is just simply looking, this is simply calculating the net present value for the cash flows associated with the property. Calculating the discount for the cost of financing. In this case, the thing that makes this one different than normal financing is you've got a sequence of financing that's taking place. It's not all happening at time period 0. Like in the finance class, everything pretty much occurs at time period 0. You're getting a loan at time period 0, one loan, $1 amount, one expenditure. Here, that's not what's happening. Here, you're getting basically a revolving line of credit for 6 consecutive months. Then you start generating income in the 7th month for the next 6 months, and what you're trying to do is to say, okay, there should be a difference between sort of the financing rate. It should be lower than the rate associated with the revenue. Is that you're saying the revenue is more risky in terms of the cash flow stream than what the revenue is, and you want to not overly inflate what your net present value is going to be for the property as a whole. Okay, it was his way of approaching it.
Why would be, can I have a question? I mean, if you total up, I mean, your cost and,
right,
and what your
right,
your gains, I mean, it would be a difference of like 6 million. So that would
correct,
be like your profit.
Yep.
So that profit, and if you do that one up to like 12 months, like that profit, that like if you had that money right now, no future value of that money or
right,
whatever it would be, and then you do it like inverse type of thing, like okay to 12 months, 12 months, yeah, exactly, to the rate it is. I mean, would it come something similar to this?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, okay. There's another rate of return that we could explore. Like in Excel, they have what's called a modified internal rate of return.
Yeah.
And with that, you have a financing rate and you have a reinvestment rate. And here the assumptions are a little bit different. Here is the dollar amounts that you are expending, or in essence financing, the expenditures is being sort of financed at that sort of finance rate, but then any income that you receive is being reinvested, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, where you're taking each of those cash flows and saying, okay, we're going to pop that into a bank account and we're going to, in essence, sort of compound it forward to the end of the investment term, and then based on that, come up with some sort of rate of return. So what it does, here's the best way to kind of show it. Let's say we've got 100,000, we've got another 100,000, then we start generating income, and we've got 200,000, and maybe 250,000 of income. What this sort of approach does is it says, okay, on this financing side, we're going to basically discount this back to this time period. On the reinvestment side, we're going to say, we're going to receive this, but then we're going to compound it forward to this time period. So the reality is, if this is time period 0, 1, 2, and 3, so this one gets discounted back one period, this one gets compounded forward one period at that rate, whatever it is. So the financing rate were 3%, the reinvestment rate were 7%. Then once we've got how much this is worth that next year, how much this is worth, then we simply take those amounts, whatever they are, put it in as the amount expended at time period 0, and then put zeros for 1 and 2, and then have this combined amount for year 3, and then we would calculate internal rate of return. And that would be an example of modified internal rate of return of using, because the assumption is that
Well, you're discounting the other one.
you're discounting this back at the financing rate, you're compounding this forward at a reinvestment rate to be able to come up with
like a middle something.
Yeah, because part, and you're saying, well, why are you doing all of this? Okay, part of this is because what, in essence, a calculator can also handle, but also there's some logic associated with it, because if you simply put in this, like in the calculator, and attempt to solve for like internal rate of return, your calculator sometimes will have a difficulty of being able to sort of say, oh, you've got these multiple cash outflows. How do those then relate to these inflows in terms of timing and sequencing? And especially if there's more than one, it almost makes it impossible. You can end up with multiple internal rates of return that are meaningless. So this is a way of making adjustments to that to come up with some sort of a meaning to an actual rate of return. Does that make sense? Now this we're not doing the quiz. Safe on that. Okay. All right, any questions?
I got a comment. Well, maybe it's a question. In the book, he also said that, or he talked about the development process where you, developers usually sell some of the units and then use that money to actually fund the project also.
Yep.
Would that go under the modified rate of return?
Yeah, it could. I mean,
Financing.
it's all a question of, yeah, the timing of the revenues, the timing of the expenses. But some, you know, I'm trying to give you simple, clean examples that you can kind of hopefully understand and get the process into your head, realizing, yeah, reality is going to be messy. You know, you're going to have expenses at the same time you have revenues, you know, throughout this process, because you could be pre-selling, as you say, and if you pre-sell those units, collecting that revenue while you're still going through the construction process, it makes it a messier process to kind of get at an answer. Now we could with Excel we could very much more easily model something like that. And that's where, once again, the financial modeling class and the Argus class, you know, hopefully pick up on a lot of that.
But that also boosts your rate of return, because if you're needing less outside sources of funds because you're internally funding, then your rate of return will actually go up.
Well, sort of yes, sort of no. Because you also have to think about, as you're putting that money back into the project, how do you think about that money? Is that, in essence, equity buildup? To a certain extent, in essence, it's money coming from the sales, and now how do you classify that? Does that really, in essence, get classified as additional equity that you're sort of contributing to the project because of the sale that's occurred, or are you just simply looking at it as an operating cash flow kind of thing?
I see.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yep.
I'm just curious about like tax credit developing.
Yep.
Kind of, it's like the landscape of that. Is that like highly competitive? Are there firms that specialize in that?
Absolutely, and absolutely.
Yeah.
Simple answer. More complex answer is the idea behind tax credit financing.
Well, developing. Like
We're developing.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a little both.
Okay.
Because you're using tax credits to help you to, in essence, finance the property or develop the property. So the idea behind the tax credits are that you get a dollar for dollar reduction in your income taxes payable for those tax credits. And so something, whether it's a low-income housing tax credit, or it's a historic property tax credit, or, you know, some other like investment zone or whatever tax credit that the federal government has sort of come up with, that all of those, in essence, are meant to incentivize a particular type of development or redevelopment. And yes, it's competitive in the sense that those tax credits that you may receive, you can typically then sell them off to other people that may need them more and get more of a tax benefit from them because they're in a different tax rate, marginal tax rate, than what you are. If you're in, let's say, I don't know, a 15% marginal tax rate, but yet somebody that wants to buy these investment tax credits is at a 40% marginal tax rate, there's a substantial value to them to buy those credits from you, and you, in essence, get that much more value out of them than they would.
I was listening and trying to learn about it, like on some interviews, and this guy said basically you can essentially develop like low-income housing for free because of the tax credit, like offsets the cost of building, and then you have the building for free, and then you're making income. Is that like a realistic scenario, or is that like a specialized scenario?
For free, I mean, yes. For free, it isn't. But basically what it boils down to is it's covering your equity investment.
Really?
Is what it means by free. Doesn't mean you're off the hook. It just means that instead of you having to put a down payment on the building and construction of this low-income housing project, you're able to basically use the funds from the low-income housing tax credits to basically provide the equity needed to do the development. It's not like that. In other words, it's not like you're getting the housing project for free.
I mean, kind of.
It is, in the sense that you're not having to put your money into it, but yet you're using the money from the sale of those low-income housing tax credits to be the equity that is required to do the project.
That's an amazing deal.
Yeah.
Isn't that also because you're working in tandem with the local government? That is
Yeah, and there could be additional add-ons there that the local government housing authority could add additional incentives above and beyond what the federal government incentives are for those properties. You could also even have some state level housing related sort of tax credits that can come into play. The bottom line is there have been, now to what extent there will be, but there have been some pretty substantive incentives to provide lower cost housing or workforce housing or whatever in certain areas of the country where development costs or land costs are ridiculously high. And it's a way to kind of try to level the playing field for folks that simply don't earn enough money to be able to afford to live there, that, you know, here's a subsidized sort of development project so that the developer can do, in some cases, the developer can also do mixed housing to where they have market priced housing mixed in with lower income housing. So in some cases, it's not even noticeable. It's kind of like you build let's say a 50-story condo tower or apartment tower, and in there you maybe have 80% of the units are market rate, but then 20% or 15% are below market rate that are available only to lower income individuals. And the idea behind that is that you don't inherently create an entire project that is all 100% low income because of potential negative connotations or just more of whether it's crime or violence or perceptions or whatever it is, that you make it a more mixed opportunity for all, you know, different economic conditions for the people that are living there.
Are you competing for a
In
contract?
New York, we call it projects. I said in New York, we call those projects.
Yeah.
Projects meaning low-income people, they have
Right.
their own daytime stuff like
But
that.
like, you know, for example, a few years ago in Dallas, downtown Dallas, there were some incentives that I think it was if you made your project in downtown Dallas, if you made your project like 15% below market affordable housing, they gave you all sorts of tax credits and tax abatements, local property taxes, and you know, but it was all meant to have inclusive sort of housing, so that it wasn't just, in essence, rich people living here, poor people living here. It was meant to be a mixed model.
Are you competing for those contracts? Or like,
I'm sorry.
Are you competing for contracts to get like
Yes.
filled certain things?
Yes.
Okay. How do you do that?
Well, I mean, once again, the local government would put out a request for proposals of saying, this is the kind of project we want, here are the conditions of it. If you meet the conditions of this, then we move forward. And in many cases, what it may be is reclaimed land that the city has maybe acquired either through condemnation, or they acquired it basically as part of a redevelopment plan of saying, okay, we're going to buy some deteriorating property within the downtown area or some other area, tear down what's there, make the land raw, clean land, and then offer it up to a developer with this sort of incentive package to get what we want as the local government within that area.
And they're selling the land, and then
Yep. Or discounting, or in some cases giving it away.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen it in a whole variety of different, you know, models or like, you know, some of the properties that I was redeveloping, you know, in Texas, that there were several instances of where I could have got buildings for free, you know, but there were strings attached, you know, and the strings were, okay, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this, things that I did not want to do.
Like what?
Well, specifically, do certain like facade improvements that would take it back to some sort of historical character that, you know, I was just like, I really don't see the value of this. It's not going to generate any more income for me, and it's going to cost me an extra $500,000 to do it. And on a $2 or $3 million project, it doesn't make any sense.
Okay. But would you be interested in doing something like that? Like a development like that, where?
Well, I mean, it depends on the circumstances. In almost all instances, whenever there's government money associated with it, there are always strings attached to it. And it's just a question of how bad those strings are in terms of what things they're going to require you to do. Because it's not like they're just giving you that piece of land or that building for free and then you can do with it what you want. They're trying to achieve some sort of social goal of having, you know, a property that is appealing or is available to a wider mix of income streams, or in the case of this particular instance I was talking about, of taking it to some sort of historical character of the area, taking it back to, you know, the early 1900s kind of, you know, facade as opposed to the mid 1970s facade that it has on it.
Because like didn't Ross?
I'm sorry?
Isn't like your personal pet peeve, couldn't that be negotiated out?
In some cases, yes, some cases, no, because usually what happens is a local government will engage outside consultants to come in essence, do kind of a master plan for a redevelopment, okay, of a particular neighborhood or a particular part of the city. And in that plan, they will usually go almost parcel by parcel and say, here's what we want it to look like. Here's what we want to, and so it's to a certain extent, it's almost like the local government with this consultant playing a game of like SimCity. You know, have you ever seen SimCity or played Sim? It's basically, it's a simulation where you kind of go in, you can pick and choose what kind of buildings you want to go where and what you want them to look like and all that sort of stuff. And so it's like the local government and these consultants sort of saying, this is what we want the city to look like. This is how we want it to be built out. This is the design, this is the height, this is the bulk, this is the, you know, the exterior facades, and then the developer coming in and having to meet all those preconditions if they want to participate in whatever incentive package there is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Did Ross and Perez make billions of dollars doing that?
Yeah.
That was their strict business model, right?
Right.
So, I mean, like, the restrictions obviously aren't too restrictive.
They're restrictive, it's a question of whether or not you can figure out a way, and you're willing to figure out a way to basically comply with whatever those restrictions are. And once again, in some cases, they're able to maybe then negotiate, you know, a better deal because maybe they have bigger backing than someone else that might be an individual.
All of that depends on funding.
Of course.
If you have a deep pocket and you want to create an arts downtown area within the artists and the coffee shop and stuff like that, yeah, that's what we're talking about. You gotta have deep pockets. Because we had some of those in New York. Anyway, I wanted to go back to an earlier part of the conversation because I try to do some small stuff. We talk about the equity piece and that killed me. And I thought about something small, way down the line. Could never find any lenders who wanted to even give me the time of day. You got no money. Here's a bottle of water and there's a door. You know, so without having funds again, just for the equity piece, the debt guy says, here's a bottle of water and here's the door.
No, and that is absolutely true in some cases, but also, you know, if there are smaller projects that local governments, especially in smaller cities, have available that, you know, in some of these projects that I'm talking about, you know, may require no money at all as long as you've got a plan.
Excuse me, well, again, to these
because I've seen it. I mean, I've witnessed it. You know, I have not done those because I don't like all the restrictions. I want to be able to do what I want to do. But business partners I've had have done those and have been, you know, in some cases successful at them, and didn't necessarily have to have any cash.
We had things like those dollar houses. You'd buy a building for $1. Or what people never understood is that you have to now go in and fix it up, and then not so much create a facade or an outside environment, but you had to create rents which were so low that
it wouldn't justify the existence. I get it.
Exactly. So many people just let the building sit here and then eventually they go
because it doesn't make economic sense. Okay. Yep.
I was just looking at your email you sent yesterday. I was just curious, which part that we went over was the develop versus the buy analysis?
That was the two ERB models side by side.
The two which models?
ERB models.
Oh, okay. All right. Perfect.
Yeah. No,
Basically that right there. And, well, specifically, the gross development profit margin.
In the topic of affordable housing and all that, are you able to restrict, let's say if I want like to give them special incentive to like teachers or first responders and stuff like that?
Yeah, you can do workforce housing that has specific conditions for, you know, kind of I guess employment-based housing.
Because at that point you're not dealing with the projects, you know, you're probably bringing some credible, better credit.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You'd be surprised the credit that's in the project.
Yeah, well.
If people in the project shove the bends, man.
Well, that's a whole cash flow. I don't know. Okay, cash flow is one thing, credit is another.
I have a question.
Okay.
Because you mentioned that you have friends that go into smaller areas. Like one of the things that I've been scared of when I look at smaller areas is the population growth.
Right.
Doesn't that deter you?
It does, okay, and actually your textbook author, I was actually very pleased to see like one of the closing statements in the chapter,
Which is why
and he talks about, you know, that as a developer to a certain extent, the opportunity may not be in what the market that you are in, you know, or the market that you really want to be in. The opportunity is where the economic engine has been lit on fire, things are happening, and then you are, in essence, then saying, okay, as a developer, I realize the market that I'm currently in is oversaturated. There really aren't any deals to be had because everybody has chased those deals down, and they're pretty much, there's just nothing left to pick over except the bones. Unless you are able to find some weird, quirky little niche within that market, you know, kind of like our you know, speaker from the first day. I still would advocate that there are many really good tertiary markets, you know, those secondary markets that are, in some cases, not exciting. You wouldn't want to live there. You know, but can you make money there being a developer? Absolutely, because there is demand for product to be built there. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
You know, and that's probably one of the hardest things I think for sometimes people to really grasp onto is, you know, to take an area that has a strong economic base that, and in many cases, you know, those in my mind have been surrounding, you know, like college campuses that have a lot of growth occurring surrounding them, and then ultimately, you know, you cash in on, you know, that the growth associated with the university that's an economic engine, and the fact that the students that are going there, you're not basing these projects off of the income of the students, you're basing the project off the income of their parents. You know, in the sense of, you know, their parents are going to be the ones paying $1,800 a month to live in a dorm, you know, or whatever it might be, or an apartment, and that sort of recognition that there is, you know, demand for housing within those areas and being able to sort of tap into it. It's not your normal kind of mindset. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. It's just when I remember I was looking at a place in upstate New York, and they had their master development plan, and none of the goal targets that they had from 2010 to present were even met. You know, they had like estimated population growth, and it was not that exciting.
Right.
But like you said, they had inventory of repossessed properties that were dilapidated, falling apart, and they needed to liquidate. But the market doesn't seem that exciting or even.
And see, that's the other thing. You know, that, yeah, you could have some amazing old properties to redevelop, but there's no economic base there to support it. You know, then, you know, it's never going to get redeveloped unless, you know, you have some major corporate relocation or expansion of something else. But there are still those other sort of tertiary markets. I mean, that, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm just off the top of my head, just pulling one that recently, like up in horrible place here in Florida, north of Clewiston.
Oh.
Clewiston.
Never heard of it.
Okay, so yeah, north on, I guess, what, 75, I think, but horrible place. It's where all the sugar, like U.S. sugar and, but you know, in terms of economic base, right now, absolutely sucks. But what they're doing is they're building a new airport there. And this new airport is going to service basically all, it's going to take away a lot of the business at Miami that is focused on perishable goods. So in other words, all the flowers and all the fruit and all the things that are coming from, let's say, South America, Latin America, instead of them going through Miami and being processed in Miami, now they're going to be processed at this airport in Clewiston. Clewiston is, I mean, trust me, you Google Clewiston, it is probably the lowest economic strata in Florida. But probably within 5 years, once this airport has been completely expanded, renovated, they're going to have workforce housing. They're going to have other things there to support this massive expansion.
When are they
But
building?
it's a place that none of us would want to live. None of us would want to, you know, in other words, be a developer living there, operating there. You follow me?
Oh, absolutely.
That's what I'm talking about. That's where you're chasing more of an economic opportunity than, you know, looking at, you know, what's here and trying to compete with all these folks that are micro mining every possible opportunity within South Florida, where it's actually an attractive place to live.
When are they building that airport?
I think it may actually be under construction. I mean, there's an airport already there. It's basically the expansion of it, adding in these things where literally the airplane can pull in to like a cooler facility. They offload whatever it is, has to go through customs inspection and that sort of thing before it then pops off to, you know, by truck or wherever to other parts of the country.
Wasn't that Airglades?
Yeah,
What'd you say?
Airglades.
Airglades.
Yeah. Okay, let's do the quizzing. All right, so we have about 45 minutes. All right.
I was looking at a duplex in Lewiston, what you were just talking about, where the rents are ridiculous.
Where?
Lewiston, the rent was $600 for a 3-2.
But how much was it?
How?